Welcome back, everyone. We're just going to jump straight on in. We'll see if we can make sense out of it. I don't know when we exactly left off, but I think it was around 21. It wasn't around 22. Something like this. Let's start right here.
Not give us the empirical base of those sub-abstractions to get us to the wider abstractions. You know, one could lay out a field deductively once one has thoroughly got the field understood. As we move up the ladder of abstraction, we're moving up the ladder of generalized abstraction until we get to the basic principles of the field. And once we've really mastered the whole field, we can then turn around and deduce. Now, he takes as a given a lot of, so he steals kind of a lot of.
You know, he just said the word deduce, and I've been having a little conversation back and forth with Michael Leibowitz in the comment section for my previous video, and I just want to share what he has to say about the nature of deduction. So just hold on one moment. So this is what Michael Leibowitz said. We do not deduce from axioms. We do not deduce our ethics. We do not deduce principles. You simply don't understand objectivism. And I just want to just replay what James just said here.
A field deductively once one has thoroughly got the
a little bit farther back right here.
Is again classic rationalism. So just your knowledge of Rothbard, I mean, I've read most everything he's written, but your knowledge eclipses mine. So just give a basically, why isn't Rothbard's epistemological method able to be properly integrated in any sense with Ayn Rand?
Because he does not give us the empirical base of those sub-abstractions to get us to the wider abstractions. You know, one could lay out a field deductively once one has thoroughly got the field understood. As we move up the ladder of abstraction, we're moving up the ladder of generalized abstraction until we get to the basic principles of the field. And once we've really mastered the whole field, we can then turn around and deduce. Now, he takes as a given a lot of, so he steals.
Yeah, so I don't know. This is sort of it's just not quite lining up what Michael Leibowitz is saying in my comment section and what James is supposedly saying here. Maybe Michael in this video can come down and clarify, but this needs to be clarified. Can you deduce in objectivism? Is deduction a valid method? Because James is proposing it. And if it is a valid method, then you just have to argue why Liquid Zulu's specific use of deduction is invalid. Not that he is using deduction ever using deduction ever is invalid, because like I've said, I don't think objectivism has ever disregarded the use of deduction, and James here is affirming it, no. But if you look at, for example, other comments that Michael Leibowitz had made on my last video, it doesn't quite line up. For example, Michael Leibowitz said to me, the point isn't about axioms, it's thinking objectivism is about deducing from axioms. And I said, is that not what objectivism is sometimes? That they deduce from axioms sometimes? And he said, never. Well, I'm just really confused, because then what is James talking about? But I digress. I don't want to spend so much time. I want to get this over with, basically.
Steals kind of a lot of Ayn Rand basics. And without recognizing the implications of those basics, he then proceeds to treat things like axioms and go on a deductive rampage. This was, I'm afraid, conditioned in him by the other great influence on his life, a guy named Ludwig von Mises,
whom we love.
I admire him enormously, but he suffered from the same, I'm afraid, many intellectuals suffer from this same psychoepistemological fallacious syndrome called rationalism. He did believe that you could deduce everything from a certain understanding.
I'm not sure what about Ludwig von Mises you love. Maybe you love him as a person, but when it comes to the entire Misesian approach to economics, and with that the entirety of the Austrian school tradition and their approach to economics, it's a very deductive method. So, what do you love about Ludwig von Mises again? Because how Mises approaches economics which is highly deductive. That's what you guys seem to not like. So,
of human action. So a science of praxeology deductively derived. For example, let's take free will or the power of ideas in history. Those were things that Mises actually believed. Now,
And again, I'm not quite sure what is a good deduction versus a bad deduction. According to Michael Leibowitz, there is no such thing as a good deduction. Deduction is cringe. We never deduct in objectivism. Then you have James over here saying, like, yeah, deduction is cool sometimes. So it's very confusing.
how do you believe something like that? They've got to be generalizations that you've derived from experience. Mises does not attempt to explain how he derives those from experience. He simply says, my theory wouldn't be possible. No one's theory would be possible. So they try and play little deductive tricks. No one can...
So, as Murray Rothbard once said in an article he wrote in the 1950s, Mises got to the human action axiom, which is the central axiom of praxeology, which is the Austrian method, and he came to it from a neo-Kantian philosophy, and he held that the human action axiom was a law of thought, while Rothbard wrote himself that it was a law of reality, that he had a neo-Aristotelian and a neo-Thomist philosophy, and therefore, while the human action axiom for Ludwig von Mises was a Kantian category derived a priori, or meaning before experience, so it was a priori knowledge. Rothbard grounded his human action axiom as an empirical Aristotelian foundation, which is what the objectivists would probably appreciate more. Rothbard continued to say that he derived his human action axiom a priori, but merely as just using the term a priori in a different way than from what Mises used the term. Just to provide some history to y'all.
Consider the subject without assuming what I'm saying. Well, that little trick is not good enough for me, because I'm still not sure if it really connects to reality until you reduce it to the observed facts upon which it is based. And so influenced by praxeology and by Ayn Rand's ideas, and not understanding Ayn Rand's methodology too well, he in effect gives us the deductive view.
I'm good. Wait. Can we rewind that just a little bit? That was a funny thing he said.
To the observed facts upon which it is based. And so influenced by praxeology and by Ayn Rand's ideas, and not understanding Ayn Rand's methodology too well, he in effect gives us...
He's still talking about Mises, right? I'm sorry if I'm like lost and he's not talking about Mises, but I think he's talking about Mises. So he's talking about Ayn Rand influenced Ludwig von Mises's Austrian methodology? I'm just going to move on. I just don't think this is worth a hang up over.
The deductive view of certain objective principles. Now, taken out of factual context like that, he's going to end up with all kinds of bizarre results. Anarchy and his arguments for it and the way he handled.
Okay, so he is talking about like Zulu or Rothbard. He's not talking about Mises because he wasn't an anarchist. Sorry if I'm... Sorry if I got a little confused there.
Certain examples and counterexamples is a classic case in point. In fact, you can get so detached from reality that you can end up saying that the Viet Cong were like George Washington.
Yes.
Now, you can't come to a factual evaluation like that unless your ideas have thoroughly detached from reality and become floating abstractions.
Right. You end up viewing this state, basically, you reify the state as if it's this existing abstraction that's just evil, independent of who has voted for the people in there, the men and women that serve, for that state. It's all evil, and then anybody who fights against it, therefore, are the good guys, i.e., the Viet Cong.
Right. Bingo.
Yeah, you just gotta argue for why it's a floating abstraction. That's just the problem. I just hope there are arguments in this video eventually.
And you end up saying the most absurd things because your original abstractions weren't tied to reality, so that you didn't know and this is the key here, you divorced the abstraction from its context of application. And by divorcing the abstraction from its actual context where it's valid and applicable, which can only be known inductively, You then turn around with this floating abstraction, apply it to reality, you'll end up saying the craziest stuff, like Liquid Zulu during the debate. Yeah, even if it means the torture of my children for stealing a penny, I understand that's a totally hatched hypothetical, unrealistic hypothetical. Yes, Zulu, there's a context that made that possible that we need to look into. But whatever, if you end up saying absurd things like, not even for stealing a penny would I save children from being tortured, wait, check.
Well,
listen to
well,
yourself, Liquid Zulu. You're
well,
saying
think about
something patently absurd.
but when Rothbard says there's certain acts that are just wrong in themselves, well, once you have that in,
I thought the quote was the opposite. I'm so sorry, guys. I'm really genuinely thought it was the opposite what he said, like that there is no such thing as a harmful act in itself. We need context to know. I'm so sorry, guys.
Absurd.
but when Rothbard says there's certain acts that are just wrong in themselves, well, once you have that,
Yeah, I really thought the quote was the opposite. I need to like replay. Editor me, replay the clip. Am I crazy?
may there not be something about an act in itself which in its very nature can be considered good or evil.
I found out the source of the confusion. I pulled out For a New Liberty. I found where the quote he is talking about. It is on page 24 of For a New Liberty for the first edition. I have a first edition 1973 original copy, but in like the regular editions on page 31. See, the problem is that it's a question. It's not a statement. If it was a statement, it would make sense, like why I interpreted that it would be the opposite. But he's questioning it. So, you know what? I'll give it to Michael Leibowitz. That's what Murray Rothbard meant. I misinterpreted, but Mike should have phrased it as a question because I thought it was a statement. I understand what went wrong. But I also want to read the full paragraph for further context so that we can better understand Murray Rothbard for why he said that. Quote, "The utilitarians declare, from their study of the consequences of liberty as opposed to alternative systems, that liberty will lead more surely to widely approved goals, harmony, peace, prosperity, etc. Now, no one disputes that relative consequences should be studied in assessing the merits or demerits demerits of respective creeds. But there are also many problems in confining ourselves to a utilitarian ethic. For one thing, utilitarianism assumes that we can weigh alternatives and declare upon policies on the basis of their good or bad consequences. But if it is legitimate to apply value judgments to the consequences of X, why is it not equally legitimate to apply such judgments to X itself? May there not be something about an act itself which, in its very nature, can be considered good or evil? I think what Murray Rothbard is trying to get at is not a purely deontological approach, but also not a purely consequentialist approach. So he's not saying that that there are. I can understand how you can interpret a deontology intrinsicism from the last sentence, but he's also accepting the consequences need to be considered too. It's both the nature of the act itself and the consequences that should be considered. So I don't think it's what Michael or James think it is. It's more of that middle ground that we should be calling virtue ethics, that it's not a duty or commandment that we should be following, nor is it that the means justify the ends, but that there are principles or virtues we should be following, which both considers the nature of the act itself and the consequences that follows. It is both an evaluation of the nature of the act itself and the consequence that it sits in, again, because Murray Rothbard thinks that the consequences and the nature of the act itself should be morally judged.
Intrinsicism, then it makes sense, right? So, and Rothbard, of course, was an anarchist, but I don't want to get into the arguments against anarchy just yet. I want to wait because I don't want to be redundant. So the other person, or at least one of the major influences on Zulu, whom he tries to incorporate, is Hans Hermann Hoppe's argumentation ethics. So Hoppe cites Mises as having reconstructed economics on the basis of rationalism, and Hoppe actually uses the term rationalism. And he correctly states that Mises didn't believe this method was applicable to ethics. So Hoppe's right on that. Hoppe then says that it's his goal to justify a Lockean private property ethic on Misesian grounds. He says this: many alternatives to a private property ethic can be proposed, of course, but their propositional content must contradict the ethic inherent in the demonstrated preference of the proposer's own act of proposition making, i.e., by the act of engaging in argumentation. He says that the right to make of control over one's body, the right to, I forget, I don't know how I got this right here, but basically he says that you have a right of control over one's body, and that is presupposed by making arguments. He says he has an a priori justification of the property ethic. He said it is not this is key. I'm going to get to that in a second. But first of all, you don't assume that you have a right just by arguing, because that assumes that rights are there. But rights may not be there. They actually have to be proven inductively before we can even say they exist, right?
I don't even know what his words mean. I have no clue what Dr. Hoppe is talking about at all.
Well,
I've said about my opinion about argumentation ethics before. I think it's a very creative argument. I think it's a very persuasive argument. But I've made a video before why I ultimately disagree with it. So
also, by engaging in argument, I'm not committing myself to anything like that. I could, in fact, give you a perfectly valid, or what I think is a valid, maybe an invalid argument, but I could give you what I think is a perfectly sincere and valid argument for why sometimes we need to initiate force.
The key there, Jim, when you say sometimes, right? So right. Even if on rationalistic grounds, like it even fails the rationalism.
I would really just like, honestly, I would really just like some sort of principle for us to know what is the right context to initiate force or not. Because we have a principle that already tells us, me and Liquid Zulu, we already have a principle that we use arguments and we use both inductive and deductive methodology in order to get our answers, both on deriving the non-aggression principle from natural law and deriving truths from the non-aggression principle in order to know who has the right in a specific context of conflict over resources. So we already know what we believe in, but I'm curious, well, how do they know what is the right context when it's the initiation of force is okay or not? Is it like, you know, it's okay to initiate force if you're an IDF soldier? What's the standard here?
Test. Yes. Because I could say to you, you know, listen, I'm assuming right now that force and aggression would be unjustified in this case, which is why I'm engaging in argumentation. But there's other cases where we can engage in force.
Right.
So it can, but the main key is
we argue about
what's the word? Be the devil's advocate. The point of argumentation ethics is that you can never justify aggression because you would have to engage in argumentation, which presupposes the non-aggression principle, by you implicitly recognizing the self-autonomy and self-ownership of your opponent that you're arguing with, that you have to allow to be a free man in order to argue with. You have to respect someone else's self-ownership in order to argue with them. You have to respect them as an independent agent with independent disagreements from you, and you have to resolve the conflict with reason. But if your argument is, I think we should engage in reason, and my argument is that I don't think we should engage in reason, I should murder you, it's what's called a performative contradiction. So, and if you don't argue with them, if you just, you know, keep your mouth shut and you just pummel them with your fists, with your two fists, and you kill them with your fists and punch them to death, well, the point is that you didn't justify it. You have to engage in argumentation. which would result in a performative contradiction. That's the steel man.
When force is appropriate. And
right. It's just rationalism.
Yes.
It's rationalism top to bottom, which is totally inconsistent
Can you
with
imagine someone,
objectivism.
And I can easily imagine someone making an argument saying, well, no, of course, most of the time I'll be peaceful and argue and try and settle it that way. But there are times when I have to initiate force. And here's my argument for it.
Yeah.
My argument for why we have to sometimes initiate force. Now, Liquid Zulu takes it to the next step. He, by combining objectivism with it, says it's a stolen concept. Now, that is absolutely absurd. Yeah. The concept of argument does not rely upon the non-aggression principle. One can have a perfectly valid concept of argumentation that does not rely upon the genetically prior concept. See, the fallacy of the stolen concept, just one little detail here. Ayn Rand identified it as a very specific thing. That is to say, denying the genetic roots that give the later concept meaning. So, for example, the classic example is Proudhon's all property is theft. Well, theft is going to be the big emotional ouch. Well, but there's no such thing as theft if there's no such thing as property. Right. So your concept theft genetically depends on the concept property. The same is not true for argumentation and the non.
You know, since they are attacking argumentation ethics, it does give me hope that they will actually address the objectivist argument Liquid Zulu gives for the non-aggression principle. The argument that any aggression ethic would have to result in a primacy of consciousness fallacy. So I would like for them to address that. That would be the really interesting part.
Aggression principle. The concept argument can be validly held and understood without agreeing with the in fact, we could argue about it. And when I'm done arguing about it and I see that I need to initiate force, I might clobber you over the head in the next minute. I'm not saying I always will do that. In fact, I may give you an argument for that.
Well, the thing is an ethical subjectivist or even an ethical.
That was a really funny laugh.
Ethical nihilist could say to you, listen, there's no such thing as objective morality, but this is what I prefer we should do. And the fact that I'm arguing proves nothing because you have to actually prove morality. You can't just assume it, which is what they try to do. So this is the now
that is a valid critique against argumentation ethics. I'm not really here to defend it. But, you know, like, you could also just argue for moral realism first and then plug in argumentation ethics.
Realism in and of itself from Hoppe makes it a non-starter for objectivists. But this to me is even worse. Well, I don't know about even worse because epistemology it takes priority. But he says it is not the wider concept of human nature, but the narrower one of propositional exchanges and argumentation, which must serve as the starting point in deriving an ethic.
I completely relate to this reaction. I do completely relate to it. I think that was a complete blunder on Hoppe. I think it was a complete regression from Rothbard's natural law argument. So, you know what? I'm completely agree with James right here. This is a relatable reaction.
That is in direct contradiction to human nature being the foundation of ethics, of morality.
First of all, it's
actually, I think Liquid Zulu would agree. I think we would all agree that this was a huge blunder. I don't know, but I'll have to let Liquid Zulu say for himself that I think he would agree.
Ridiculous what he's saying there. The nature of argumentation is what determines whether come on. That is absolute, pure, unadulterated rationalism. And look, is he going to say that the deductive conclusion from that, therefore, it's going to be a form of intrinsicism like Zulu in the argument. When it comes to playing it out in reality, he's got to be wedded to that regardless of the absurdity of the consequence.
Okay. So now I want to get to Zulu. So in a debate I had with Zulu, Zulu said this. And I want you to just tell me what's wrong with this for starters, and then we can move on to some of his other stuff. He says, metaphysics, all you're doing is deducing corollaries of the existence axiom. The same is true of law. All you're doing is deducing corollaries of the non-aggression principle.
Wow. No. Axioms are validated by sense perception, experience, seeing. You cannot.
I don't think Liquid Zulu would deny that. I think they completely misunderstood what he was saying. It's like it's like I said before in the comment section in my previous video. I was like, as far as I understand how induction and deduction works, is that an inductive truth is discovering a truth through an empirical method, like the scientific method. And then a deductive truth is when you derive an implied truth from an inductive truth. You establish an inductive truth through an empirical method, a proper empirical method, and then using a proper deductive method, you can derive what is already implied in the inductive truth to discover new knowledge that is not really new because it's already preloaded in the inductive truth. That's what deductive truth means. They correct me down below if I'm wrong. I'm no perfect. I don't have a degree in philosophy. I'm just an amateur online. But that's how I understand it, and I think that's how Liquid Zulu understands it. And I don't know. Just like we'll just have to see.
Not know an axiom until you look and see reality. In fact, to form the implicit axiomatic concept of existence, I need more than one instance of perception. That exists. That exists. That is. That is. That is. Oh. Now I can abstract, oh, but now my car keys were in my pocket, the toys were in my crib, and now they're not. There's something as opposed to nothing. Boom, I've formed the concept of existence from experience. The axioms are themselves derived empirically in the broadest sense. So no, it is not.
And then you deduce truth from that. Like you can deduce the truth that because existence exists, therefore, I must be conscious of existence. Is that not how objectivism goes? Is that not a deductive truth of objectivism?
A matter of deduction. The full validation of the axioms is when you see it in reality. Full stop. Once I understand there's existence, there's consciousness of existence, the thing is what it is and nothing else, and that's true of all of my experiences. Now I generalize and then I connect the dots. Only a very high level of abstraction, living with these, in a sense, inductively derived, or let me put it this way, conceptually generalized. Some people will say concept formation is a form of induction, without getting into that argument. In the form of generalizing from experience, I've got these concepts, and in order to interrelate these concepts, I'm using a kind of deduction. In other words, when Ayn Rand says existence is identity, looked at from a different perspective, what she's doing is she's already got all that experience, and then she's showing how these implicit, now explicit, because we're engaged in philosophy as metaphysicians, how they interrelate, And so metaphysics is not a matter of, in fact, causality. Think of it. I can't get to the concept of identity and the relationship to causality unless I have other concepts that I've derived from experience. Entity, thing, action. I need entity, and more than that, I need a whole bunch of experience with action. So if I release a helium balloon, it'll rise. If I release my ball, it will fall. If I push the round object like a ball, it'll roll. If I push a block, it'll just thump over. And so I need a bunch of those experiences to be able to abstract the concept of cause and effect. And then when I abstract the cause and effect, I say, oh, it's simply an application of the principle of identity that I learned. Things act according to their nature. But think of all the concepts derived from experience that I needed to have abstracted, at least implicitly, to get to the concept of cause and effect.
Right.
It's not merely a deduced corollary from identity.
Yeah, no. It is not merely a deduced from a corollary. It is also implying a method of induction before you apply the method of deduction. You just not have proven that Liquid Zulu is only using a deductive method. In fact, this wouldn't make any sense since he is claiming that he is deriving the non-aggression principle using objectivism. So you need to eventually, you got I don't know, you got a little bit more than an hour left to show me that you will eventually address Liquid Zulu's argument using objectivism in order to get the non-aggression principle. You just kind of just been claiming that he's a rationalist.
Leonard actually says the corollaries are self-evident, just like the axioms are. He said make sure I get this right. He says that the process is similar to induction in that it's generalizations from experience, but it's self-evident and can only be, pointed out basically ostensively. Now, to me,
that's what I end up doing. I end up saying, look at this, it floats. Look at this, it falls. Look at this, it rolls.
Now, to me, Jim, right at the root, I mean, this is at the very beginning of objectivism. Zulu and his followers are disqualified from being objectivists in that they don't even understand the basic epistemology and how the axioms work.
Zulu is not an objectivist metaphysician.
You should go on his brain website and look at his writings on metaphysics and epistemology, and you guys should dismantle it and show how it's wrong, because you guys are just saying things.
Period.
Full stop.
He says that objectivism is just the application or the unraveling of the primacy of existence, but he's doing it deductively, which means no.
You can't get to the value of life, why life is the standard of value, why we need values, what values are all about, and the phenomenon of value pursuit from simple metaphysical axioms. No, that is derived by a series of generalizations and inductive generalizations where I realize, aha, it's living organisms that pursue ends. It's animals that have consciousness that help them pursue their ends. And there's human consciousness, which is different than other animal consciousness, that gives me an ability to conceptualize them and have free will and choice when I approach the subject. All of those are derived from experience, and those generalizations have to be in my toolkit before I can even begin the subject of ethics. Now, it's true they all assume the metaphysical axioms, absolutely correct. But presumably, I've gotten my metaphysics squared away. And this also, if you're academically trained, there's a huge temptation. Ayn Rand explains her metaphysics. Ayn Rand explains her metaethics. Aha! She's deducing that from this. No, she ain't. She is showing you the logical relationship, and it will form a deductive pattern in many cases.
Is kind of a contradiction. Don't we think that he's saying in one breath deduction is cringe, and the next he's saying actually we like deduction? Let's replay this one more time.
Academically trained, there's a huge temptation. Ayn Rand explains her metaphysics. Ayn Rand explains her metaethics. Aha! She's deducing that from this. No, she ain't.
She is not deducing that from this.
She is showing you the logical relationship, and it will form a deductive pattern in many cases.
Okay, so she's not deducing this from that, but there is a deductive pattern emerging. I am confused. Make it make sense.
But the principles themselves are all derived from experience.
He even says,
okay, so does Liquid Zulu claim that we need to avoid empirical methodology in order to derive our principles? Did he ever claim that? He claims to be an objectivist. And if you go on you watch his videos, or you go on his brain website, you could see that. Let's go on his brain website. Let's find it. Let's just quickly look what he has to say about axioms, just really quickly. The term axiom, as used in philosophy, has a distinct meaning. That axiom as mathematicians often use it. The mathematician, at least in the modern one, normally use axioms to denote a set of interconsistent but arbitrarily selected rules for a given arbitrarily selected system of logic, which is what they would say. Everyone would say this is all the objectivists would say this is rationalism. These are assumptions that are taken to be true in order to allow for further reasoning within the given domain, but that are not, or perhaps cannot, be validated. The philosopher, at least a good one, does not use axiom to mean some arbitrarily selected starting point, aka the rationalism that they're claiming Liquid Zulus to be. In philosophy, an axiom means an irreducible primary, a starting point that cannot be escaped in any process of cognition. Axioms themselves are not proven. There is no proof that A is A, as proof itself relies upon axioms. An axiom is rather validated. An axiomatic concept is the identification of a primary fact of reality, which cannot be analyzed, that is, reduced to other facts or broken into component parts. It is implicit in all facts and in all knowledge. it is the fundamentally given and directly perceived or experienced. Immediately, this entire video has collapsed based on this one thing I found on Liquid Zulu's argument. They should delete this video, which requires no proof or explanation, but on which all proofs and explanations rest.
You deduce causality. Now, I want to be importantly, he doesn't say this is how we learn these things, but he says this is how they're validated. He said they're validated by deduction.
Axioms are validated by experience, sense experience, and for you to be able to have.
He's saying, guys.
Okay, but the principles themselves are all derived from experience.
Right. He even says that you deduce causality. Now, I want to be importantly, he doesn't say this is how we learn these things, but he says this is how they're validated. He said they're validated by deduction.
Axioms.
As I just read, like when it comes to any axiom, Liquid Zulu believes that how you get an axiom, it is derived from sense experience. It is derived from induction, not deduction. And after you have that axiom, I mean, he didn't say it in that part, but like when this is what I'm saying now, after you have that axiom, then you can start deducing things from that axiom.
Are validated by experience, sense experience, and for you to be able to abstract them even implicitly as axiomatic concepts, you have to have multiple experiences. They are generalizations like every other abstraction.
Okay, now what he says is that the only way that Ayn Rand is able to defeat David Hume's idea that there's no causality, or that you can't prove causality, is by deduction. Now, here I'm going to need your help a little bit.
Talk about anti-objectivist.
Yes.
Boy, does he miss Ayn Rand's answer to Hume.
The
James
answer is this:
it's so funny.
that what Hume attempts to do is locate this thing called necessity.
Right.
That this necessary, he wants to impose necessity on reality. And because he can't find it anywhere, he says there's no logical relationship or no necessary relationship between cause and effect. What Rand does say is that entities act according to their identity. It's not some necessity that's imposed on the concepts. It's the fact that each entity acts according to its identity. And what that means is causality basically is a corollary of identity, in that what a thing is determines what it's going to do. Am I correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Let me just say something to Zulu. Zulu, you missed the whole point and importance of Ayn Rand's Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. What Hume and Kant misunderstood lies at the heart of this very subject. It is from experience that we get the idea, and it's got to be at the primary level of deriving a concept from experience. Hume was a nominalist. He did not think that there was a relationship that Ayn Rand developed between concepts and experience. He was completely disconnected that way. So he's like an ultra nominalist who doesn't see the connection between concepts and the perceptions that underlie them. In solving that problem, but in solving the problem of the relationship between concepts and the facts we perceive, Ayn Rand is saying, this is what y'all missed. David Hume, you missed the idea that we can form concepts and that the concepts themselves exactly relate in an objective way to perception, something Hume did not understand or believe. So the answer to David Hume is Ayn Rand's Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. We have to be able to form valid concepts, and form valid concepts straight from sense perception. And this is the relationship between sense perceptions and our concepts, according to Ayn Rand. And when you look up a very important chapter on axiomatic concepts derived from experience, there we have the answer to David Hume. Mr. Hume, what you're missing here is that there's basic concepts we can derive from experience, and causality is one of them, okay? In fact, all of our axiomatic knowledge is derived directly from sense perception. In fact, all sense perception, in one sense, my perception of green is at that same, quote, axiomatic level. Green isn't an axiom, because it's unlike existence, consciousness, and identity. It is not present in each and every instance of perception. There's only the times when I see green stuff.
No, but the senses are axiomatic.
But green is green is derived in the same way that existence, identity, or action, entity are derived. All it is another simple inference and a generalization from experience. Balls roll, blocks don't.
Yes. So I want to clarify something. I think this might be a good spot to do it. The point here isn't that Zulu is wrong, but I believe he is, or that anarcho-objectivism is wrong. The point is they're not objectivists.
No, his whole approach to metaphysics is anti-objectivist.
In epistemology as well.
Pure rationalism. Yeah. Oh, and epistemology as well. Deduction is not.
There is no, you could say, I could like lend 99.9%, I could lend everything that they said up until this point as completely correct. There is no way you can be honest and say that he is just a pure rationalist, and he hates sense perception. He hates empiricism. He doesn't believe that knowledge can be derived from experience at all, just pure rationalist. You guys just literally are dishonest. It's literally just dishonesty. That's all I gotta say.
How we figure stuff out.
Or validate. Importantly, it's not how we validate.
Not how we validate our primary knowledge. Right. That's got to come from sense perception.
Okay, so metaphysically and epistemologically gone, in my view. So the anarcho-objectivists are already disqualified. But then they take this step, like Zulu did, where he says politics is not an appropriate subject of philosophy. Okay, let's just say he's right.
You know, the funny thing about that anarcho-objectivist comment, like they're attacking specifically Liquid Zulu. What they can't do is that they can't like attack another specific anarcho-objectivist, like Morris and Lyndon Tannenhill. Like, are you not allowed to be wrong as an objectivist? Let's just say, like, anarcho-objectivism, wrong direction. But, like, do they not deserve the title of being called objectivists just because they're wrong? Is it any time that you're wrong that you're not an objectivist anymore? Is objectivism just truthism? Because all you're doing is you're specifically just attacking Liquid Zulu, but that's not the same thing as just attacking anarcho-objectivism as a whole, because anarcho-objectivism, well, at least the term was just invented recently, but the idea of it predates the term. It predates Liquid Zulu. It goes, you know, I would say, like, the best example, the best official starting point, besides, like, Roy Childs, let's just say the best starting point would be The Market for Liberty by Morris and Lyndon Tannenhill from 1969, where they start off in the book saying, we love objectivism, we love Ayn Rand, but we think she made a mistake, and here's why. And we have this thing called the non-aggression principle. I don't know if they said the non-aggression principle specifically in the book, but they basically use Ayn Rand's argument for the principle of non-aggression, and therefore they go on to construct a hypothetical free market society without any government where everyone respects each other's rights to non-aggression. So, yeah, I'm just saying, like, you can try to take down Liquid Zulu, but it's not the same thing as taking down anarcho-objectivism as an idea, because Liquid Zulu is not anarcho-objectivism, and anarcho-objectivism is not Liquid Zulu. Liquid Zulu is an anarcho-objectivist. He is one anarcho-objectivist. He popularized it. He is not the first one to do it, and he's not the first one to write about it. He may be the first one to coin the term. Maybe I was the first one, given I made that my anarcho-objectivist. I mean, whoever coined it first could have been neither of us anyways. Actually, you know what? I will say that neither of us have coined it. I don't have proof. I don't have a source. But I know that there exists a video online where the term was mentioned before that predates both me and Liquid Zulu's time online or something like that. So, anyways.
How do you claim to be an objectivist by nullifying one of an entire branch that Ayn Rand thought was important in politics, right? Now,
He rejects,
Zulu-
in effect, Ayn Rand said that the key fields of philosophy are metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics, and she added aesthetics because it directly relates to the human mode of consciousness, our conceptual nature.
What does he mean by that she added? I don't know. Whatever.
So these are the 5 branches of philosophy she recognized. And he's claiming to be an objectivist and saying a whole 20% of it, 1/5 of her entire philosophy is misbegotten. So he fails on epistemology, he fails in metaphysics just substantially, and then he denies the very existence of another branch that I
politics.
recognized.
Yeah. Well, what he says about aesthetics, but so I don't know. But now, what he does say is that law.
I would know. He accepts the Randian theory of aesthetics. You could watch this video on In Defense of AI Art, and you can find out.
Is a proper part of philosophy. So I really want to get into this. I really want to get into his legal theory. I want to get into anarcho-capitalism. So he says this is how he defines law.
I hope this is where the real meat is. I really want them to get into his argument for the non-aggression principle.
The beginning of a essay he wrote. Law is to be understood as a normative discipline which identifies certain actions as just or unjust. That is to say, law is a subset of ethics which identifies which party ought to have possession in a given conflict.
What is that duck face? I'm so sorry. Sometimes I look over and James is making the funniest faces of all time. I'm sorry.
Okay. This is something else that he does. He says that unless it's objective law, it's not law. So rationalistically, he does away with the idea that any legislation is law. No, that's not law because it doesn't fit.
Based? You know what? I gotta pull up a little something. I need to go find it because I wrote a little something for a long dead project, but I feel the need to talk about it right now. Alright, I think this is what I wrote. Anyways, that's what I wrote. Where it all went wrong. The Randians' error stems from a misunderstanding of rights. Their misunderstanding is from an even greater error, a primacy of consciousness fallacy. Observe that the issue of rights arises and applies in a social context, and more specifically in connection with the formation of an organized social system. The man lives on a desert island. There was no question of anyone recognizing or infringing his rights. The issue wouldn't come up. Even if several men lived on a desert island, if they have no organized social system, the issue would still not be applicable. See, that's the beginning of the problem, which I will get into. There would be no one in such a case to implement the idea of rights. No courts, no police, no government. The issue of rights applies, in short, when men propose to live in an organized society and to implement certain principles of social relationships. In that context, the principle of rights say there are certain areas which each man must morally be left alone to act independently. And so I wrote, this right here is where it all went wrong. While the libertarian theorists would agree here that Crusoe alone on an island does not give rise to the issue of rights, Peikoff made the grave error of saying rights are no issue when man has to live amongst other men. He makes the mistake of saying implicitly that conflict and scarcity is not the problem law has to deal with, that rights are no issue here. Peikoff asserts that rights only come about when men come together and form a social organization, implicitly when the state forms. It is the assertion that rights only exist when politicians decree there shall be rights, that politicians' consciousness have primacy over existence. Let this book for anything blah blah blah. Anyways, I don't endorse this book. This was a failed project. Please do not read it.
With what he says is
he thoroughly refutes the so-called legal realists and legal positivists. That's not just because it is the law. We can't even apply the concept
right.
of law
But the argument is really over what is proper law.
Proper.
Right? Now, I happen to agree that any legal opinion you have or any political opinion you have is going to have an ethical base to it. Whether it be ethical subjectivism, something. But it doesn't mean that law only applies to what is just and unjust, because somebody could say, as Bentham did, rights are nonsense on stilts.
Well,
There's no such thing as justice.
he is the one setting us up for Bentham's reply. Your idea of the one and only true
Right.
thing you'll call law is nonsense on stilts. Can there be such a thing as an unjust law? See, I need a concept law that applies to unjust laws.
Yes.
I need a concept of law that's
I mean, Liquid Zulu's argument would be you don't need it, and in fact, it's actively epistemically harmful. That's like his argument. So
wider than a valid law under the proper morality.
Okay, so he also says this. He says the law identifies which party ought to have possession in a given conflict. Well,
Yeah.
what about in the case of rape or just violence?
Murder.
Yeah.
His whole approach about scarcity.
what do you like? Do they not understand that bodies are resources? Like, it's not resources as in like diamonds from Minecraft. It's not resources like how much lumber you have. It's scarce means. It is physical scarce means. It's a very broad idea. I think this is more probably, I'm gonna willing to give them the benefit of the doubt that they're confusing what Liquid Zulu specifically means by scarce resources or scarce means and conflating it with a colloquial meaning of resources, like attributing it to just like lumber or precious metals or something like that. I don't know. Let's just rewind that.
I need a concept of law that's wider than a valid law under the proper morality.
Okay, so he also says this. He says the law identifies which party ought to have possession in a given conflict. Well, what about in the case of rape or just violence?
Murder.
Yeah.
His whole approach about.
Yeah, I'm gonna give them the benefit of the doubt here. I think this is an honest misunderstanding. The clarification is that your body is a scarce resource which could be in conflict over, such as horrible acts that we shall not speak of, or very mild things like an older brother punching a younger brother. I don't know. We've all been there, right, older brothers?
Scarcity. That is just.
We're gonna get to that. Don't go sick. We're gonna get to that.
But the point though is that most crime is not economic in nature. That is to say, maybe I'm doing it for revenge. Maybe I'm doing it out of jealousy. Maybe I was just a hothead who misperceived things and okay, it's not because of the scarce space that you occupy that I'm hitting you in the face, Michael. It's because I'm pissed off at you that I'm hitting you in the face. And so most of rights violations are not, you can impose a property framework upon it. It just doesn't make sense though.
Okay, so he says this is he said.
I want to invite James onto my YouTube channel. I think he just seems like a really fun guy to talk with. He's so entertaining.
Says the definition of law is ethics applied to the issue of conflicts. Now, importantly, in objectivism, a definition is something that distinguishes a concept from all others. There are plenty of areas of conflict where law does not and ought not apply. I'm arguing with my wife. There's a conflict, right?
Yeah, he's just not understanding what the word conflict means. You know what? I wrote a pretty good definition about it, I think. I wrote a pretty good, solid definition about it. Let me find it. So, what is a conflict? I said a relationship between two individuals where forceful or threat of forceful possession of the means in conflict is expressed by one or two parties. And again, scarce means, for example, I can have a watch on my wrist, but that same watch cannot be on your wrist at the same time and in the same respect. Therefore, it is illustrated that the watch is a scarce means because I can't have the watch and you having the watch at the same time. Either you have the watch at any given time in the same respect, or I have the watch in my position at any given time in the same respect. It cannot go both ways. It is a scarce resource, and therefore the issue of conflicts arise. And since conflicts are human affairs, human morality applies. Well, who has the right to own the scarce means? The right being the action that ought not be impeded It doesn't mean, a right does not mean you ought take the resource. For example, the resource could be black tar heroin, and you ought not inject black tar heroin into your body. But you have the right to inject black tar heroin into your body, because it's simultaneously true, and not a contradiction, that I ought not inject black tar heroin into my body, and others ought not stop me if I do it anyways. See, that's not a contradiction, that's not mutually exclusive. Therefore, the issue of rights as a specific subset of oughts arise, which is not, it's not an ought imposed on the one who bears the right, it is an ought imposed on everyone else, because everyone else ought not stop the person who bears the right. So,
Who gets the shower right now? There's a conflict.
Every time you and I argue about the Constitution, Mike,
Right.
we're having a conflict. Neither of us intend to
Right.
violate the other's rights.
yeah, conflicts don't just mean disagreements. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. But I won't give them a full benefit of the doubt, because that just means that they just don't know what they're talking about, which means they came ill prepared. If they don't know what they're talking about, so they came ill prepared, so they don't even understand Liquid Zula's position. I'm just gonna give them the benefit of the doubt that they didn't maliciously ignore that crucial piece of information of what a conflict is. I'm just gonna assume that they were lazy and did not care.
Yes.
Neither of us are likely to violate the other guy's rights, and yet
So-
we have a quote conflict.
But okay, so beyond that, though, I mean, beyond that just being wrong, why is he wrong that law fundamentally is about scarcity and conflicts? I'm asking you because you, of course, I didn't get into this as part of your credentials, but you actually graduated law school and were a practicing prosecutor for nearly 20 years.
Yeah, I was a prosecutor, and I did get my Juris Doctorate degree, and I studied from the great classical liberal constitutional analyst Bernie Segan, by the way. No, we need law because of physical force, physical coercion. It's not a matter of conflict. It's a specific kind of conflict. And it is the nature of, that's what he keeps avoiding too, the nature of physical force. That is what law is all about. Now, most of the time, my conflicts, we can go our separate ways, even continue to argue perhaps, and that conflict is still a conflict, but it's not a forceful conflict, only physical coercion. Law, in my view, is needed only because of the phenomenon of the initiation of force. If there was no physical aggression in this world, we would need no law. Unfortunately, people are perfectly capable, their free will is so broad, they're perfectly capable of initiating force or aggression against other people. But it is physical force. And he talk about ignoring the essence
It's also the threat of force too, of course.
of Ayn Rand's contribution to politics. You know, John Locke and Thomas Jefferson had this harm principle. Jefferson said, so long as we do not injure one another, we should be free to left to our own pursuits. John Stuart Mill, had a similar harm principle. Well, what the hell is harm? Am I hurting your feelings? So we need a little more clarity on that harm. Ayn Rand and John Hospers, the first libertarian candidate for president, he was a philosophy professor, and he zeroed in and he said, in politics, that was Ayn Rand's greatest contribution to classical liberalism.
While the Randians attribute that the central aim of at least what they call proper law is the initiation of force. But what's really going on is mutually exclusive human action, which is just a more elaborative and better understanding of what's going on. Because it's a fine definition to say that the non-aggression principle is the principle that aggression or the initiation of force or threat of force, is wrong, which that's what it is, aggression. But in order to get even more accurate conceptually, even more accurate what is aggression, like what is the initiation of force or threat of force, it is specifically over the issue of mutually exclusive human action because there is scarcity in the world. I can't have the watch on my wrist and for you to have the watch on your wrist at the same time in the same respect. Therefore, because of the nature of human action and because of the nature of scarcity, when you have two people trying to vie for control, or just one person, it doesn't have to be two people, because it could just be the victim who's accepting it, doesn't make it right, but at least one or two of the parties must be imposing their will, so to speak, through threat or initiation of force in order to obtain the resource, because it's scarce. And both of them can't have it at the same time. Only one of them can have it at the same time. And so, with this elaboration, we then have a better understanding of what is the initiation of force, because we understand what is scarcity, which then completely dismantles the Randian defense of intellectual property, because there is no such thing as intellectual property, because property pertains to scarce means, and ideas are not scarce. I can have the same idea in my head, and you can have the same idea in your head, and I can have physical, like for example, you could produce a movie and start production on CD disc to distribute them, but you claim you have some sort of copyright or IP, so therefore I'm not allowed to copy my own CD disc of the same movie and distribute them and sell them, because that would be violating your IP for some reason, because you own the idea of the movie. But if we only own the resources at hand, and I own the resources of my means of production, and you own the resources of your means of production, there is no problem with you selling a CD disc of your movie, and me selling the CD disc where I created the CD disc with my own resources, and it just so happens to be your movie. But because ownership is pertaining over physical scarce means, like the CD disc, and not over the idea of the movie, I own the resources that just so happens to have your movie on it, and therefore I can sell it. See, with that precision, that we know that the central issue of what's going on with the initiation of force, or retaliatory use of force, is over the issue of scarcity, because of the nature of human action and reality. You can only understand this with a robust understanding of the initiation of force or threat of force, something that goes beyond just saying the initiation of force or threat of force. It's not elaborative enough, and only anarcho-capitalists and Rothbardians have that grasp of understanding, or at least they should.
He specifically identified the only kind of harm that should be the business of law: physical coercion. And absent some form of physical coercion, such as the taking of your physical property by force or fraud, or harming you or your property by physical force, law ought to be out of it, because otherwise you are free. Freedom is that state in which people are not using force against one another.
Okay, so Zulu told me in a debate, he said there's an objective answer to any given legal dispute. Now, just to be clear, what we were talking about was the amount of jurors that should sit on a jury, or what levels of due process there are, age of consent, and for sexual behavior. And what I tried to tell him was, it's like, and Dave,
Cross that out on your anarcho-capitalist bingo card. He just said age of consent.
Smith actually brought this same point to him, is there is no objective answer for everybody to have an age of consent, but you do have to have a general age of consent. Otherwise, each person, if you take the standard of communicate your will, whatever the hell that means, but let's even go further. Let's steelman this. Even if you were to say that sexual consent should be based on intellectual and emotional maturity of the person having sex, right? Even then, that doesn't help the guy who meets a girl, at the mall, because he's in no position to assess these things, and he needs to understand ahead of time what the legal, consequences are of his actions. But Zulu, again, he just thinks there's this objective libertarian law out there, and we're going to get to this, just needing to be discovered. That's not to say there aren't objective rights or objective principles of law, but
Well, as he admit himself, so ownership is a myth and a social construct. So, Mike is contradicting himself, of course, but I'm just calling it out.
things such as the appropriate sentence for a given crime. There's no intrinsic idea out there that just tells you what is the appropriate thing. Part of this is going to end up being arbitrary out of necessity, but it still can be based on a principle. You just don't end up with a rationalistic mathematical answer.
No.
Translation: we could still have guidelines that we call principle, but they can't, they can't be robust and sophisticated. We need to have exceptions because I feel like so. Translation.
In fact, you can't. What you're doing sometimes with large numbers is approximating, and we need the approximation. In other words,
sure.
One of the examples they were talking about is the driving age. And, and at some point we can say, well, if you're not yet 15, you can't have the maturity and skills and physical and mental capacities. So there's a minimum age at which you can even get your learner's permit. And, it was so funny. Smith asks Zulu, so what's your principle there? Zulu comes back with some bizarre rationalist, when
communicate their will.
Yeah, exactly. Wait, whoa.
Yeah, that part of the debate, I remember that. That was really funny. I think those two were just talking past each other because they just had two different ideas of what is will. I think it was just more of a communication breakdown, to be honest. But, at the end of the day, picking a birthday for everyone where their rights begin at this birthday, it is arbitrary. It can't be like you can have a general guideline. Like, don't have sex with minors. That's gross, and you're wrong. And it's high. Like, if you have a 17-year-old and it's the day before their birthday, like, it is arbitrary to say just because the next day they turn 18, then like they can consent. They still cannot consent, possibly. Just because they're 18 does not give them the ability to consent. The ability to consent is on an individual basis. And I think that, like, there's plenty of glory to have for philosophers to work out the nature of consent. I don't think it's a closed shut case at all. I think there's plenty to be worked on. And I think, like, it's a valiant effort for, people like Liquid Zulu to figure it out. And I think that, yeah, like Liquid Zulu and Dave Smith were talking past each other, and perhaps maybe Zulu could have communicated his position better. But it's not quite a fleshed out part. Like, we know that picking a birthday is arbitrary. So therefore we know that, like, consent is arrived from an individual basis and an individual experience. How you arrive at consent for consenting for anything is dependent on the individual. And in order to find it out, I don't think it's really quite worked out yet. And that does not mean that therefore we should not work on it. I think we should just work on it as philosophers. Now, what I gotta say is that even though it is not a very robust communication of the idea, it does have to do something with expressing your will. Which I would say that Dave Smith had some good points to clap at with. It's like, well, my children, when I'm telling them to do something, and like they're jumping, I think he used the example like jumping up and down the bed. Like my child's will is clearly that he wants to continue jumping, but that it's not safe for him. And Liquid Zulu said something back in return. It's like, but he's a child. He doesn't understand the consequences. It's a very interesting discussion. I think sometimes we just need to be like, we don't know. Let's work on it. Let's figure it out. So,
my immediate reaction was, how about a driving test? Skill in driving once you're past a minimum age, pass the damn driving test. That seems like a good test. In any case, even if there is, such as the one I articulate, let's say that what I just articulated is the correct answer.
And, I'll link down in the description below, I wrote a little thing about guardianship, which is similar to the topic I was talking about. Because the issue of, like, what does it mean to express your will, and, like, how do you arrive at maturity and consent is tied up in the theory of guardianship. So I'll link down in the description what I wrote about it.
with Zulu, even if there is a right and wrong answer to every question, even if there is, people will disagree. That disagreement can be even sincere. They can
Sure.
two people approaching the same
Yes.
thing could look at the same situation and both honestly,
Right.
sincerely, using their best
Yeah.
reason, disagree.
Yeah.
Even if there's only one correct answer. One of
Yes.
them's right, one of them's wrong. Now, how do we know that? Liquid Zulu will constantly say, aha, well, now you're introducing the primacy of consciousness. No, no, sir. What I'm introducing is the fact that consciousness possesses an identity. That is an equally important objectivist principle. You have to take into account into your political system, and this goes right to the heart of it. Some of the absurd things he said in his discussion with you, his first discussion with you, was, my God. In any case, one of the first things he said in his discussion with you.
Atheist objectivist said, "My God, debunked."
Let's see, let me try and get this exact. Try and restore this as best I can. I just did a brain malfunction.
Okay, while you're thinking, can I clarify something real quickly?
Yeah,
I just want to say, I'm not even saying necessarily that somebody that was omniscient couldn't identify the appropriate or the most efficient, effective number of jurors. What I'm saying is that human beings don't have that capacity, right?
Well, there are some things that we can't know, at least now, but I'd go even further. Even if we could know, there could be a difference of opinion. And it's that he has to take into account all the way down the line. That is to say, even if...
I mean, like, why, though? If, let's just say, hypothetically, you have the correct answers, but you have people who disagree with you. Well, how does the nature of people disagreeing with you change the fact that your answers are correct? So...
one of the absurd things, this is it, I remember now. One of the absurd things he said to you, in effect, was everyone in the community would have to agree with my belief in what the valid law is. And that really is the case. You pinned him.
I mean, yeah, like, in order for an objectivist society to exist, you need a society of objectivists. Like, yeah. Like, it doesn't... The truth of the matter is that the Libertarian Creed is the correct position. The non-aggression principle is the correct principle of justice. It just so happens that we live in a world where most people don't recognize that. And our largest institutions to our smallest institutions, to varying degrees, don't respect the non-aggression principle. But that doesn't make it incorrect, because most people disagree with anarchists, or specifically Rothbardians. That doesn't make it incorrect because people disagree. I'm not really sure what James is getting at. If that's not what he's saying, then what is he saying?
Him on that pretty well. So in other words, everybody in this community has to have a total uniform agreement with you about what the law actually is. Only one true valid law thing you'll call law. There has to be, in effect, total consensus about that for his society to work.
Not just near total consensus.
The only decent political theory takes into account that people will disagree. It is an inevitable fact of human nature that people will disagree. In fact, our system now, let me go to one very extreme case. Say there's a complex contract dispute. We have two people who think, no, this is the correct answer, this is the correct answer. Now, I know in a lawsuit, both of them are biased witnesses. Let's set aside their bias. Let's say they're both being as rational as they can be, and they still disagree. That is a fact that will happen again. Zulu hasn't spent a lot of time in America's courtrooms or in Scotland's courtrooms. Because if he did, he would see that not only are these witnesses biased and may not be seeing it objectively, but even the judge may have a hard time saying, oh my gosh, that's a very interesting question. I'm going to have to think about that. Let me take the weekend to even consider your different arguments, gentlemen. And then one side says, oh, that's wrong, Your Honor, and I really, really believe it. And they can sincerely believe that and be using the best reason, both of them, both sides, and they come to a different outcome. That kind of disagreement is going to occur even where everyone agrees to the basic principles.
Yeah, again, like I said, like, just because people agreeing or disagreeing about anything, does that affect the truth of the matter? Does that affect that non-aggression is still a right and aggression is a violation of right? Why do I need to factor in? This is a discussion about ethics. This is not a discussion about economics. What I think is going on here is that there's a conflation between the economics of a free society and the ethics of a free society, or just the ethics in general, whether you have a free society or not. Because the non-aggression principle is true. It's true right now. It's always been true. It's always been true so long as there have been human beings. But the thing is that for most of our existence, we just never discovered this principle, because, it hasn't, we've only been really honestly attempted the project of philosophy for the past 3,000 years, let alone, like, our modern conception of human rights, which has only been around for a few hundred years, maybe. So, like, we're just now, essentially, we're just now figuring this out. We're just beginning to figure out all of this stuff. And so, I don't think it's really fair if you, if you project humanity 50 million years in the future. We've only had civilization for a few thousand years. Imagine millions of years in the future. What could humanity be? And how simple, whatever is the correct theory of rights, let's just not even affirm the non-aggression principle here. Just whatever is the correct theory of rights, how could we understand rights 50 million years from now in a courtroom? I think these people lack a little bit of imagination. Likewise, whatever is the correct answer, there's a separate issue to the economics of justice, which I would not claim that the economics of a hypothetical anarcho-capitalist society, which is just a way to conceive of an anarchist society, because there is no one way to be an anarchist in an anarchist society, and there is no one way an anarchist society should look like. The economic theories of a free society proposed by anarcho-capitalists is just a theory, and it's a theory that I agree with, but it's just a way to do things. And it's supposed to tend towards the non-aggression principle. But we're not claiming it to be perfect. Judges will make mistakes. Lawyers will make mistakes. The thing is that we just don't have the state, the big, giant, massive crime syndicate that enslaves us all. And getting rid of the state, I think it would be pretty cool. It would be pretty cool if all of humanity was not enslaved by giant mega plantations called federal governments. Gigantic slave crime syndicates called governments. And if justice operated on a free market, our argument is that it would tend towards the ideal of non-aggression way much more. Way much more. And there is no amount of ways that I could put the word ways in a sentence that will ever illustrate how much of an understatement it is. How far away we are from justice. We don't have a justice system. We have a slave institution. We live under slave institutions. A free society is not a utopian society in the sense that everything works out. I'm not claiming, nor do I think Liquid Zulu would claim, that free market private arbiters and free market private lawyers are always going to get it right. But the thing is that we have the free market mechanism, which will greatly tend towards the non-aggression principle. That's the idea. But independent from the private arbiters and the private lawyers in a hypothetical anarcho-capitalist society, whether they got their interpretation of the non-aggression principle right or wrong in the courtroom and in their verdict, it doesn't matter. There is a correct answer. And we can discover that through the principle of non-aggression. So, no one said it was going to be easy, but we got to try.
of
Yes.
a legal system. But worse, I
How far are we with 54 minutes? About halfway through.
think a valid political system has to take into account a much broader scope of disagreement. A much broader scope of disagreement.
He has an answer for this. And his answer is this, Jim.
Yes.
In this, he says the non-aggression principle implies through a long series of deductions, estoppel, retaliatory force, enforcement, retribution, all to just be deduced in a long series of deductions. That's not objectivism. It's also not true, right? You also can't do it, but it's not objectivism.
Well,
and that's
he goes
the main
along
point.
with the
Again, I'm just waiting to hear about what is right deduction and what is wrong deduction, or if deduction is correct at all, because I'm getting mixed signals here.
Kinsella and I think implicitly Hoppe view that you own your right to retaliate at any given point down the road.
Hold that, Jim. Don't
disagree.
I'm going to get to that, but I want to
Yeah.
go through some of the things he says.
Yes.
I'm just going to tell you the quotes and I want you to comment, and we're going to get to that and to the
Okay.
anarcho stuff. I promise.
Okay.
This is in the legal polylogism section of his essay. As we have seen, law is strictly derivable from the nature of argumentation as a human action employing scarce physical means. Therefore, to assert that there are multiple different legal codes is to assert that there are multiple different logics, which is called polylogism. Legal polylogism
Literally true. Literally correct.
then is the claim that different men may be able to adopt different logics in their argumentative justification of a system of property rights.
I mean, it's obvious. I mean, didn't everyone just hear the self-contradiction there? That is absolutely absurd. A person can use logic and disagree with another person. A person can use
That's not what he's saying. Liquid Zulu is saying there cannot be competing forms of true logics in epistemic reality. Polylogism, it's not to say that people can't disagree. It's not to say that people can't employ different logics. It's to say that there is a correct answer. There is not multiple correct answers in the sense of polylogism as Liquid Zulu described. Meaning to say you can't have a true non-aggression principle and then some sort of aggression ethic or aggression principle also true at the same time that would contradict the non-aggression principle, because contradictions can't exist in reality. Yeah, there are like different methods of logic, different sub-logics, but they all need to be consistent under one ultimate true logic, that like A is A. Contradictions don't exist. They all need to be consistent with, you know, the principle of non-contradiction, that contradictions don't exist. And there may be multiple ways you can approach in order to exemplify that principle of logic. But all the logics should be consistent with each other. If you have an inconsistent logic with the rest of, you know, like if you have a logic that is inconsistent with the principle of non-contradiction, and that logic is somehow true too, you have a polylogism. That's my steel, man.
valid logic and disagree with another person. I mean, it's just...
Which, by the way, little history. The term polylogism was coined by Ludwig von Mises in order to identify the philosophy of Karl Marx, who proposed that there are multiple valid forms of logic that directly contradict between each other, and those were the logic of the proletariat and the logic of the bourgeoisie. And so he held a polylogism.
absolutely simply does not follow. I mean, arguments do not commit you to non-aggression, period. The act of argumentation does not. Scarcity is not the issue. So in fact, most instances where people initiate force, it's not a matter that the resource was scarce. I wanted yours. If I'd gone out and gotten a job at McDonald's, I could have afforded that same thing that I just stole from you. It's not a question of scarcity.
I mean, you couldn't, because the nature of the thing that you're trying to steal is that the person doesn't want to give it up. It's non-consensual. So no, I mean, yeah, you could go buy him off, but that's not the issue here, because it's not the issue that, oh, I can't afford this. It's that I don't want to buy it off of you. I just want to take it. So I'm not sure what he's getting at here.
It's a question of I want that what you have right now. So
like you want it, and you know, and we all know that only one person can have it. So that's scarcity. So, I mean, James here is just denying the nature of scarcity. He just literally is just denying the nature of scarcity. Which the nature of scarcity is exemplified in the principle of non-contradiction. Because I can't have the watch, and you have the watch at the same time in the same respect. Because it would be a contradiction for me to have the watch and for me to not have the watch at the same time in the same respect. That would be a contradiction. Because of that, we know that scarcity exists. So he's just denying the nature of scarcity here. No?
The idea that physical force is somehow to be equated with scarcity is on the face of it absurd. Now, sometimes I'm sure, you know, you have your desert island example where people are fighting for a limited number of resources where scarcity. See, and there's a broader point here.
It doesn't matter if you're on an island or in the Guardian of Eden. You know what? Point to Hoppa. I'm not the biggest fan of Hans Hermann Hoppe. You guys, subscribers, would know that. But point to Hoppe. Even in the Garden of Eden, where you could reach up and pluck an apple, and the apple reappears immediately because you're in a magical realm, in a magical garden. You still have scarcity over your body. You still... Adam only has his body, and Eve only has her body. So even in the Garden of Eden, where resources are plentiful, if I pick an apple, that apple is still an apple. It is what it is. And I can't have the apple and not have the apple in my hand at the same time. It is not the case that Adam can have this specific apple in his hand at the same time, in the same respect, and also for Eve to have that same apple, that same specific apple, in her hand at the same time, in the same respect. Those things cannot happen. And this is the Garden of Eden, where resources are plentiful. So it's not about our resources are plentiful or not. It's the fact of the matter is that a resource has identity. It is what it is, and it cannot be what it is and what it's not at the same time. It cannot be in my hand and in your hand at the same time in the same respect, because that would be a contradiction.
You can't use economic logic at this point.
You absolutely need to, you very much need to use specifically the word praxeological logic. Wait, what am I saying? Sorry, let me rewind. It's not just about economics here. This is not an issue about economics. This is an issue of praxeology, which is a more general science from the science of economics. The social science is subsumed under the umbrella of the general science called praxeology, which is the study of human action. And human action is the employment of scarce means towards a desired end in order to relieve a felt uneasiness. That's the Misesian definition of human action. And it doesn't just pertain to economics, it pertains to anything related to human action, including the issue of justice and rights.
Is invalid. He's completely reversed the hierarchical order here. You cannot use economics to discuss force at all. Free market economics will always say something like the free market kind that you, me, and Zulu read. They will say the government has introduced an inefficient distortion by initiating force, and therefore the principles of the free market are being prevented from operating. The use of force negates the free market, negates all free market economics. You cannot use free market economic thinking when talking about force. Force lies outside. You must ban force before you can even say, these are the principles of economics. This is, how marginal utility works, this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There can be no market in force. There can be no market in force. Full stop.
Stop. We are going to get to that too. Okay. This to me, I'm just going to read it and you'll see. He says, any notion of a quote source of rights end quote, is indicative of positivism and more fundamentally of the fallacy of primacy of consciousness.
Yeah.
Rights simply are. They don't come from some consciousness, whether divine or social or individual. It is not arbitrary thoughts or decrees that are the source of rights, but the logic of justification in conflict. Okay, let me say my piece first.
Before.
That is hilarious. They're all in agreement. They don't really understand Liquid Zulu. They don't really understand how much Liquid Zulu agrees with them. They don't really understand how much agreement they have. And they don't understand where the disagreement begins.
Okay, first of all, human nature is the source of rights. That's first.
Yes.
So there is a source of rights.
Yes.
It's not arbitrary. He's correct.
But
the idea that rights simply are is an intrinsicist idea, that they're just intrinsic to reality, rather than a relationship between humans with a consciousness and reality and the interactions with each other. And he says he actually gives the source of rights after saying there is none, and that is the logic of justification in conflict. He's so wound up in rationalism that argumentation plays such a huge role for him. It's just that debating logic, but the point of epistemology isn't to win arguments.
No, I would need epistemology alone on a desert island. I would need words. I would need logic. I would need
ethics.
And so the main point of using logic and words is not force and social order. No. Nor is it even an implication of it. But let me go back to a point that I made earlier. He confuses two important things. One, the primacy of consciousness with Ayn Rand's, which is true, it's a fallacy. But I can believe in the primacy of existence and still think that the nature of consciousness has to be taken into account. It is the nature of human consciousness that is the source of rights. Consciousness possesses an identity. Humans are conceptual beings. Humans have the capacity for volition. That is the source of their knowledge and their primary tool of survival. I've got to have all those abstractions to derive the concept of rights. The concept of rights derives from the facts of nature, but one of the facts of nature it derives from is the nature of human consciousness. So like I say, when it comes to, even if I agree, if everyone in the community agrees with your theory of law, there will still be disagreements about the application of that law. And that law means forcing people around. So we're going to be using force and people are going to be disagreeing about the application of that force. Get over it, Zulu. That's the nature.
Remember, force is not the issue. It's the initiation of force that is the issue. Because retaliatory force is justified so long as it is proportional.
Of consciousness. Here, he's going broader. He's saying, look, it's primacy of consciousness to say it's the nature of human consciousness that from which we derive rights. Sorry, it is. Not conceptual beings, if we were not volitional beings. It is the nature of consciousness possesses an identity. That's a crucial objectivist principle, Zulu. And it is those facts about human nature, the nature of their consciousness, which are the important facts of reality from which rights are derived. We are volitional, conceptual beings. It is our basic tool of survival. If I can't get those generalizations, I don't stand a hope in hell of deriving rights the way Ayn Rand derived rights. So, insisting that consciousness possesses an identity and has limitations, and there'll be disagreements. The fact that humans are of such and such a nature, their consciousness is of such and such a nature, are the fact existence. The facts of existence that provide the basis for any correct understanding of rights according to objectivism. So Zulu, what you're doing is you're confusing two things. The primacy of consciousness, which says consciousness controls reality. I don't buy into that at all when I take into account that people will disagree because they're conceptual volitional beings.
Okay.
Force is wrong because it negates the application of individual judgment.
He should be clarifying he means the initiation of force is wrong, and also like they talk. Oops, did I? What
operation? That makes it inhuman to initiate correct
understanding
of rights according to objectivism. So Zulu, what you're doing is you're confusing two things: the primacy of consciousness, which says consciousness controls reality. I don't buy into that at all when I take into
No.
account that people will disagree because they're conceptual volitional beings.
Okay.
Force is wrong because it negates the application of individual.
The crudeness of his words are getting to me. We already know that they don't believe the initiation of force is inherently wrong. They think it's sometimes wrong and sometimes it's not. Second, he didn't say the initiation of force, he just said force. Which I'm pretty sure he just means the initiation of force is wrong. But we already know that they don't believe in that.
Is to say my tool of survival is being prevented from its operation. That makes it inhuman to initiate force against another human. You're violating.
But you have already talked about how the initiation of force is okay sometimes, so it's inhuman unless if I don't feel like it.
Human nature, in effect, and it's fact-based. It's inductively derived. Zulu, it is the nature of human consciousness that is the factual source of rights.
So, okay. Now we get.
I mean, he's partially true, because it is about human consciousness. You need a being with the capacity to reason in order to get the rational concept that is rights. Animals don't have rights because they don't operate with reason. Now, this is a very black and white statement, and there is a gray area I would like to explore. I think it's very interesting to explore the nature of non-human but highly social animals nevertheless, and explore like the possibility that there could be like a flickering on and off half broken light bulb, metaphorically, that is reason within, like, I don't know, chimpanzees or apes or whatever. I think that's worth exploring in certain really smart animals, and explore like this gray area between obviously this organism does not possess rights, like for example a single-celled organism, and versus obviously this animal possesses rights because humans, and like you look in between and you're like, wow, apes are really smart. But anyways, I digress. It's not really the problem. The problem is that he's partially correct, but he's forgetting what is the issue of rights about. Yes, it is derived from natural law. It is derived from the nature of humans. But what is it about? It's about scarcity.
Into this, I'll read it, but this he gets, I believe, from Kinsella, because Kinsella glorifies common law as if it's intrinsically superior to legislation.
I'm willing to accept that. I mean, like, I would need to like verify by reading Stephen Kinsella, but it seems like to me this is kind of true. But you didn't hear it from me.
So Zulu writes this. So broadly speaking, there are two types of legal systems. Those based.
And clarify, not to say that we cannot use common law, English law, Roman law, even obscure laws like, I don't know, Amish law or something like that. Or like legal contracts between 49er gold miners in 1850 California or something like that. Like, we could probably find use value from it, but like, you know what? I'm just going to move on. I don't think I know what I'm talking about here.
upon judge found law, and those where the legal principles are decreed by legislation. This might even be a quote from Kinsella. I'm not entirely sure. But I noticed here that the normal term that's used, although judge found law is sometimes used, the normal term is judge made law.
Yeah.
For common law.
Yeah.
But judge found law sounds better because now you're implying that they found this law somewhere out there.
In there.
I mean, yeah, I mean, like, because judges don't make justice, we discover the truth about justice. Do you guys not believe in an objective theory of justice? Spoiler alert, they don't.
Yes. So he says, Roman law and, he says the distinction between judge found law and law as decreed by legislative fiat is an important one. In a decentralized case law systems, the judges are at least setting out to do justice. First of all, we don't know that.
I mean, no, we do know that. I mean, that is like the nature of judge found law. The judge is hearing the case, and he is going to come up with a reason for what he thinks is the right or wrong answer. as opposed to law based on legislation. That's not the role of the judge. The role of the judge is not to hear out the case and then decide through his process of reason whether he's right or wrong, but he's at least attempting to use his own reason to discover who he thinks is in the right or in the wrong. But the judges nowadays in the modern world, they have to adhere not to what is right or wrong, but what is decreed by politicians. Does it follow the law written by legislators and politicians? The lawmakers. Does it follow what it says on a piece of paper? Did you break the law because the lawmakers made a law on a piece of paper and said so? Or did you break the law because you're actually in the wrong? Of course, just because judge found law, that doesn't mean they're going to get to the correct answer. But at least you get to the necessary condition to even get to the correct answer, which is using your own reason, as opposed to listening to lawmakers and politicians.
And how their principles when it was both work with abstractions.
Right.
And it doesn't matter who came up with the abstractions.
And both can be false. Both can be wrong.
Whether it's a bunch of judges spread across England over the last several centuries, or it is the Roman Senate, they're coming up with abstractions. Yes. Abstractions that get reapplied to reality. Okay, so while there is an important legal, and we're way down the line here in the world of law, where I distinguish, say, continental civil code stuff from English and American common law stuff. Right. Okay, that's a historical distinction of some importance. It is not of philosophical importance. Law in every case, and in America we have statute, and in Great Britain we have statutorily created law, not just judge-created law. So, but the point is, all law is an abstraction being applied to reality, a principle being applied to reality.
There's no reason that common law would be superior. There's nothing. It's still human beings.
The Constitution made great strides.
Yeah, he's just completely ignoring the fact that judge found law is operating on the judge's own reason instead of the judge trying to be in accordance to lawmakers. Because the role of the judge in judge found law is to judge what's going on and make a judgment on who he thinks is right or wrong, independent from appealing to some sort of lawmaker. And the lawmaker, his job is not to judge who's in the right or wrong. He's got his own alternative motives. Because he's not a judge. He's a lawmaker. He's trying to, however lawmakers are, this kind of just depends on the type of government, So, beyond this is just matter of discussion of, the specific nature of the government we're talking about. So that just kind of depends on a case-by-case basis. But the fact of the matter is, like I said, at the end of the day, the judge found law is based on the judge's own reasoning, which, of course, would tend towards a better answer. Hopefully, would tend towards a better answer, instead of being obscured by appealing to some sort of arbitrary standard that a lawmaker made up.
Over and above existing English common law.
Yeah. No. And by the way, just to throw this out there, because common law was severely lacking, the English instituted Magna Carta, the Petition of Right.
And let's appeal to context, since objectivists like to appeal to context. As they should. Appealing to context is a good thing. Being contextual is a good thing. The judge is judging the particular case at hand. The lawmaker is not. The lawmaker cannot know and foresee specific contexts and specific particular cases in the future. That is the beauty of judge found law. Because the judge is judging the particular case right here now. Anyways.
English Bill of Rights.
The English Bill of Rights. By then, you have a centuries-long body of common law, and they're saying, guess what? We're going to fix a bunch of that with our philosophical principles, our big abstractions here.
So this is what he says is the distinction between common law and legislation. Now, he says this is in stark distinction to a fiat law system where the so-called laws are not rational, but are rather arbitrary commandments issued top-down by a legislature. Why can't they be arbitrary commandments issued by a judge? That doesn't make any sense.
It is true. That is true. He is making a completely true statement right there. Again, what he's ignoring is the tendency towards better answers when a judge is judging based on his own reason. Because he has the specific context at hand of what is going on, unlike the lawmaker. That doesn't mean that the judge is going to get it right. I don't think Liquid Zulu ever made the case. It's more of just about tending towards better answers. And that's why judge found laws superior.
The fact that, well, I'll give you this. Common law allows judges to work with experience and be inductive. But the induction
I just literally, thank you, James. Thank you.
is not precluded in statutory law either. Let's say the legislature engages and has a bunch of hearings. They call a bunch of witnesses. They get all the statistics and call all the experts. They too are deriving it inductively. In fact, any valid generalization will be derived inductively. The only real difference is how you're letting the judge through case to case experience derive it inductively. And I agree, there's something to that. But
Thank you, James.
This is not the important distinction. Lots of common law judges got it wrong.
Yes.
And a bunch of statutory laws got it right.
And by the way, with judicial activism,
I don't really understand why we're going through this, because it's not that we're saying that just judge found law is good, because we're talking about a very particular form of judge found law with a free market mechanism, which would make it way better.
and they get it wrong. Okay, now I want to get into this point that you made, the retaliatory force point, because Zulu says that each person should be allowed to decide on his own to retaliate. And when I brought up the point of, you're not talking about due process.
I made a video a long time ago about Ayn Rand's really bad argument against employing your own means for retaliatory force, because she did not believe fully in the right to self-defense. So I believe they're about to try to defend Ayn Rand and defend the notion that you do not have a full-on right to self-defense.
Process, jury trial, nothing. This person's deciding on his own. That person can be wrong. He says, no, that's Cartesian doubt. First of all, that's not what Descartes had talked about when it came to doubt. That's the first thing. His doubt was an epistemological trick to demonstrate, show that he could come from rationalism, deduce from the I think, therefore I am. But what I think that Zulu is talking about here is an objectivist epistemology. When Leonard talks about, if you've done your due diligence, if you've considered all the factors, if you're in your context, taken everything you can into, then you have a right to be certain. And there's no reason to doubt, based on the principle that humans are infallible and sometimes wrong. There's no reason to impose that on you epistemologically. But what Zulu does is then changes that to judge another person in saying, well, that person, there's no reason to doubt him. But there is.
I mean, if that is Liquid Zulu's argument, I would disagree. But I don't think that's Liquid Zulu's argument. I don't think he's saying that we should not doubt people who employ force and it's claiming to be retaliatory force. I think what he's just saying is that, people have the right to use proper retaliatory force, and they don't have to call the police. They don't have to appeal to some sort of outside third-party institution in order to carry out the right to self-defense.
Because, first of all, there's the saying that extraordinary claims call for extraordinary proof.
Yeah.
You're talking about using force now. So it's not enough to just say, well, this guy's likely right. We need to have measures in place to discover whether he's right or wrong.
Exactly. How do I even know that? I think 10 years ago, Michael, you initiated force against me. You pushed me, and this was 10 years ago. So now I come along and I push you back. And let's just keep it proportionate, because he's got all kinds of other problems with vigilantism.
Ooh, I'm seeing an immediate problem for Liquid Zulu here, because I can see how I could be on Mike and Jane's side in the podcast, and I can see myself already, I can construct an argument against Liquid Zulu based on that he believes in the estoppel principle. As far as I understand, and so far that I still think he does, he believes in the estoppel principle, which means that he believes in retribution force. If if you push me maliciously, I have the right to push you back. Which I don't agree with the estoppel principle, actually. So this is going to be interesting.
Well, let's keep it as simple as we can. 10 years, I wait 10 years to push you back. And you claim, well, I pushed him because he pushed me. Let's make it more vivid. You shot me in the leg. I healed from it. 10 years later, I shoot you in the leg, which is exactly what he says. You now have this lifelong right to get revenge down the road someplace.
Yeah, there's no statute of limitations.
Exactly.
Nothing.
I can't defend Liquid Zulu here. I can totally agree with them. I don't know how my argument will compare to their argument, but I already have gripes with the estoppel principle, so I don't believe in retribution force. I only believe in restitution force, meaning to say that if you shoot me in the leg, you have to at least pay for my medical bill and other things, but I won't get into it.
So I come up and I shoot statutes of limitations.
And
What
never
we have
mind.
those.
We know
We're
the
accounting for the nature of human consciousness.
and part of that nature is we know the unreliability of witnesses.
And could you be mistaken? Could that just be an excuse on your part? You could just be making up this excuse.
Yeah. Then he says, well, then that other guy has the right to retaliate against him, and
Bingo.
whatever.
So now we're stuck in a situation where we're going to have ongoing violence and retribution going on, vigilante justice out in the streets. No, when people say in reality what anarchists are calling for is gang warfare and violence in the streets, he concedes that right up front by saying we all...
Hold up, I want to repeat that. That was a little funny. It was about right there.
Justice out in the streets. No, when people say in reality what anarchists are calling for is gang warfare and violence in the streets, he concedes that right up front by saying we all have a lifelong right to vigilantism. No, it's not the fact that I was had my rights violated that allows the retribution to occur down the line. It's because we can know it is truly retribution. And therefore, we have to take it out of your hands, and we have to take it into a world where there are objective principles and standards and means of proving whether or not that happened. I'm still opposed to vigilantism. That is to say, could you have got, if there is a government, and this is what he's trying so desperately hard to avoid, I have a means of getting justice if there's a government. Only if there's a government do I have a means. He would say some self-protection agency, or he'd leave it up to the free market to decide what even organization is doing this. So I'm not even sure that they all would have the same rules, which is absolutely essential. But even leaving that aside, what you're saying is that I can wait. Now, the example you used with Zulu in your talk, I've stolen your television set and I'm running away with it. So long as you got that television set in your arms, I can use reasonable force to acquire my television set back from you. That is a matter of simple self-defense. There are principles like I can't use deadly force simply to...
You can't shoot me in the back of the head over the television.
Simply to reacquire property. I can't use deadly force unless there is a threat of deadly force. And so I have to have certain principles that operate on this. Okay? But the point, though, is that once we get detached, once he escapes from my sight, then it becomes a matter of my word. Okay? Now I tell the cops, I have a means of getting retribution. I call the...
Well, what happens if there are no cops? What happens if there is no institution of justice? Does justice not exist? Do we just live in the jungle? Is it might makes right? I would argue that might never makes right. It doesn't matter whatever social institution or institutions have been constructed in human society. What if it's just two men on an island, Crusoe and Friday, and Friday steals Crusoe's stick, and there's no one to appeal to? Well, how do you know who's in the right and who's in the wrong? We have to address what happens when you can't appeal to an institution and like a third-party justice institution. Where's the justice? All that the Randians can say is that there is no justice because there is no justice institution. And we fall into the jungle ethic that might makes right.
Cops, I saw Joe steal my television set. Okay, based on that, I get a warrant and I search your home and I find your television set. Aha, now we know that in fact he stole your television set. Your say-so is a total individual say-so, and I'm not going to trust any individual say-so. We need an objective mechanism whereby we can know that, in fact, that guy stole your television, and know that it's not you. That's why individual vigilantism must be prevented, must be prohibited.
Absolutely.
Now, get this. When it comes to the actual punishment for that, anarchists like Rothbard will say the most absurd.
What is the difference between a man with a badge and a man without a badge? Why does the man who has a copper piece of metal on his chest therefore has this special privilege to use this set of force against a criminal, but that same set of force cannot be used by this other individual who doesn't have a piece of metal copper on his chest, and he's not called a police officer? What is the metaphysical difference between these two men? Are they not metaphysically equal? Why is one subhuman? Why is one in the subhuman class called citizen, and the other one is in the superior human master class called the police?
Things. So if I torture you or cut off your arm, you thereby get a right to cut off my arm and torture me. No, my God. When you end up saying
That is my genuine reaction to the estoppel principle.
things like that, you are living in a world of Wild West anarchy, vigilante justice, gang warfare, people cutting off arms, torturing people. 20 years ago, you tortured me. And so now, 20 years later, I claim the right to torture you. You do see the practical problems with that, right, Zulu?
Okay, so I want to just there's a whole bunch more to go over, but
Can't say the P word around Liquid Zulu. Don't say the P word around Liquid Zulu. What are you doing, James?
first thing is, in his debate with Dave Smith and previously, Zulu has said things like, if they, I think we talked about this earlier, but I really want to get into it a little bit now. If Martians were here and they told me that I could save the world by stealing a penny, I wouldn't do it. I similarly had a debate with one of them, where I said to him, well, if you were on an island and you were stranded there, you're going to die. And some guy comes with his giant boat, and he lands on the island, and you say, hey, can you give me a ride? And he says, no, I like traveling alone. If all argumentation didn't work, what would you do? And he said, well, I would not force him to let me on his boat. I would die. And what I'm trying to get through to him is you're elevating a downstream ethical principle above the root. In objectivism, it's the life of the individual that is the standard of morals, standard of value.
But that does not mean that because the standard of the objective's morality is your own life, it does not mean that you must survive by any means, because you would be violating the rights of other people. Because the standard is not a psychological egoism, Stirnerite, might makes right ethic. It's not that I must survive by any means. It means that I must survive so long as I don't infringe on the rights of others. But as soon as you're infringing on the rights of others, you are violating that standard in the objectivist principle, because it's not your life that is a standard, it is life that is the standard, which includes your life, but it must also equally apply to everyone else's right, because no one has an obligation to sacrifice themselves to you in order for you to survive. And if the only way for you to survive is for others to sacrifice themselves to you, you're a parasite, and that goes against the objectivist principle.
Value. You're dying for a downstream conclusion of ethics about not initiating force, but you're undercutting the base of it, and you're going to die.
So no matter what situation I'm in or how thoroughly irrational that other person is being, no matter how much the conditions by which rights obtain, and see, that's the thing. Without this inductive chain up, as opposed to the deductive method that he uses from the top down, you don't see the conditions under which those principles obtain. So, for example, you say honesty.
Again, what's really going on is that Mike and James use the inductive method to go up, but then they don't want to use the deductive method to go down. What me and Liquid Zulu are doing is that we're using the inductive method to go up. We arrive at the non-aggression principle, and then we deduce truths implied from the non-aggression principle downward.
famously, you just don't tell lies, right? That's the deontological approach, regardless of consequences. No. There are contexts. In fact, Ayn Rand builds this into her principle of honesty. It is in gain.
Which is not a principle. It's more like a guideline. I've said this in the previous video.
Values that dishonesty is with another person is always wrong. If I am wrongfully having my values threatened, then it's perfectly like the famous Jew example. Jews come knocking at, the Nazis come knocking at the door. I'm hiding Jews in the attic. I'm not going to say, go check upstairs. I'm going to say, Jews? I don't know any Jews. You have absolutely a right to lie. In fact, the honest thing to do, the reality consistent thing to do would be to lie to the Nazi.
I mean, it's just literally a contradiction. You're just saying the honest thing to do is to be dishonest. Instead of rather just saying it is moral to be dishonest in this example, because there is no principle of you must be honest. There is no principle of honesty. I like to rather say there's a principle of rational honesty. In the sense that, yes, in general, you should be honest, but there are exceptions, because it's not that the principle is that you must be honest. I would rather say you must be honest within reason. Now, you could alternatively say that, well, why is the non-aggression principle not working like that? Well, hopefully maybe they will address Liquid Zulu's argument. There's a conceptual confusion with Mike and James between the concept of a general guideline, such as generally be honest except for in these exceptions, and then a principle where there is no exceptions, because that's what a principle is.
Similar with force. I'm not going to make some absolutely religious intrinsic assertion that
that's
never under any circumstances.
It's not a religious commandment, right? So now his response was, I would rather live as a man or die as a man than live like a beast. And I said, look, if it was a situation where I was going to have to live my life by repeatedly forcing people to drive me around, I wouldn't do that. But when it's a one-off thing, I can do it and then restore normal circumstances. I can compensate the guy for his trouble, for his time, for anything I've done to him. But I then am alive to do so.
Let me just give a little common law, since he brings up the value of common.
It's the law of the jungle. Survival by any means. The objectivists do and don't believe in this. This is just an internal contradiction in typical Randian objectivism that Liquid Zulu is correcting and making it consistent. You know what this reminds me? This reminds me of something. So I've been reading the dirty mystic Platonist Alfred North Whitehead in his book Process and Reality, and I'll talk about this when we get into my part 2 video on notes on process and reality. Subscribe if you want to watch that video. In my notes, I said a philosophical school of thought has, quote, performed its full service to philosophy, end of quote, when it has realized its, quote, two presiding philosophers. These two men are, one, the one who survey experience with some adequacy, but inconsistently, end quote, and the one who puts the theory through purifying it of inconsistency. Anyways, that note reminds me of what's going on here, sort of. What it reminds me is that you have Ayn Rand, who produced some inconsistency, following from that a philosopher or philosophers who then makes things internally more consistent in the philosophy.
Common law. Let me just, since I am a lawyer, and give you a sense of what the criminal law here is, and a sense of what common law had the good sense to derive. It's perfectly okay sometimes to commit theft. Did you know that? Under our existing law. One can come into court and say there's a necessity defense. It's called the defense of necessity. If I am confronted in a situation where I am absolutely cornered, a worse result, a worse crime will happen, or a worse outcome will happen. A significantly worse outcome will happen if I don't. So let's say, and Zulu will say, well, wait, how did you get into yourself in that situation? But for whatever reason.
That's the other thing I want to get into too.
Yeah, but let's say for the moment I'm in a situation where it is life and death that let's say there's a firefight going on and there's these evil people initiating force against these innocent people, and I'm standing next to a gun shop. I'm going to pick up that gun without asking the consent of the owner and use it to defend those people. In order to save lives, I'm happy to commit theft, Zulu. Let me just repeat that. In order to save lives, I am happy to commit theft. And you can say, well, the law will assume the person who's left the gun shop owner would have wanted you to do that. So you build in the assumption that you can do that. It's still theft. I don't have his permission.
Yeah. Assuming
law of
permission is not a way to go. Right.
Yeah. So assuming the law of necessity here, I'm preventing starvation, say, and I'm stealing a loaf of bread. Guess what? That's a complete defense to the theft.
Yeah.
Now, it's a hard defense to sell because you really got to say there was no other option. It was a much worse alternative, but I was faced with this necessity of a greater harm versus a lesser harm. And if there's a significant difference, like the penny versus torturing your children or why killing your mother or something like that, the law already builds in by the defense of necessity. Guess what? It's okay to violate this less important law.
Essentially, all he's just saying is, I don't like what you're saying, Liquid Zulu. I don't like it. Great argument, James. Thank you.
If you're protecting people from this more important legal value.
Now,
that's built into our law, and something I think every objectivist would be happy to agree with.
Right. Now, you said you brought up it's how you got in that situation. Zulu seems to think, and it's probably based on rationalism. Let me just give you a quick thing of my take on objectivist ethics. Objectivist ethics provides us with principles that are most likely to lead to our long-term survival and flourishing. There's no guarantee of that.
Oh,
right.
No.
There's accidents happen. It's like a guy can exercise and eat right and die of a heart attack.
Exactly.
But Zulu seems to think that nobody could end up in these situations through no fault of their own. But I could get shipwrecked and end up on an island, and then some dick doesn't want to give me a ride. I'm getting on his boat. Like, and I could pay him later, but I'm getting on his boat, and I'm perfectly moral in doing so because my life is the standard of value. And I can certainly.
It's life is the standard of value. It's not, I must survive by any means and others ought sacrifice to me in order for me to live. It's that every individual must operate with their life as their own standard. And the standard is not that others must put aside their own life in order to sacrifice to me because my life's more important than other people's lives. It's that everyone deserves the right to life, liberty, and property, emphasis on the life part, equally.
Continue to live as a rational being. Now, if I couldn't, if I was in a communist torture center or something, well, now you're saying I can't live as a rational being, and maybe then suicide is the proper course of action.
I did talk about this in the last episode.
But as long as I can return to normal circumstances, there's nothing wrong with doing it in that situation. So one of the things they say to me, Jim, I asked
on that point.
Okay, go ahead.
Not always responsible for situations we find.
No.
But I'm going to go one further. Even if to some degree I am responsible through, say, simple negligence, and the consequences are still life and death. Okay, let's say that I was an irresponsible.
I really think these are just so silly because at the end of the day, like, if there's a mass shooting going on, like, first off, the gun owner's probably going to go out and help. And if not, you can come in and be like, can I borrow a firearm? I'm going to go help out. And the guy's probably going to be like, yeah, sure, I will. And even if he doesn't, what is the context here? We're in a free society, right? I'm assuming there's a lot more firearms. There's more firearms than guns in America. These like I've said before, these hypotheticals are devoid from reality. They lack practical context when the non-aggression principle is made for a practical context. So even if like the guy doesn't want to give up his guns, the guy doesn't want to give up his guns. It's not your gun. If we live in a society that is so ill prepared to deal with a mass shooting, which we do currently, but I'm assuming a free society, which is an armed society, probably all the able-bodied men are carrying. That's what I would imagine a libertarian society to look like. Most of the able-bodied men are carrying. This really should not be an issue. I have established the context, and we can understand there really is no issue with the non-aggression principle. But if you conveniently remove the context so that you have a ridiculous hypothetical, well, you're going to get ridiculous answers, of course. But we don't live in a ridiculous, illogical world. We live in a logical order, natural world. So a natural law, a natural order society, most of the able-bodied men are carrying.
responsible person. I should have brought my wallet with me. I didn't bring my wallet. Okay, but I'm preventing death. I can still prevent the death, even if I was to some degree responsible for getting myself in the situation. What's the greater imperative, Zulu? The fact that, okay, you were a little irresponsible to get yourself there. Okay, so
Yes.
I guess F you. You just got to let the mass murderer get away with it. That's absurd. Can't he hear himself?
No.
So Dave Smith is going to emotionally, although Dave had no principles.
No, we're going to get to him too, because I do want to address him a little at the end.
Yeah, but still, Dave is going to win over most of the audience because they're going to hear just how absurd the consequences of Zulu's position.
Right. Now, so I asked one of these guys, I said, look, what if your anarcho system could not produce the results that you wanted to do? What if it necessarily rendered rights insecure? His answer to me was that it's right in theory, therefore it's right in practice. There can be no dichotomy between theory and practice.
I agree with the rejection.
But the problem is, what that means is if it doesn't work in practice, it doesn't work in theory. It doesn't mean
What it's totally working in practice. If someone murders you, you're out in the jungle, Crusoe and Friday, no institution of justice exists. Friday murders Crusoe. And we look back and we're observing this situation from up high, and we can say, yep, confidently say that Friday murdered Crusoe, and Friday's in the wrong. The theory works. The theory is not meant to stop Friday from killing Crusoe. Friday's gonna kill Crusoe. That is a physical fact that is happening, hypothetically. But alongside that, there's a moral fact. The moral fact is that Friday's in the wrong. And that's what the theory of rights is saying. The theory of rights is not a how-to guide to defend yourself from murderers. The theory of rights is to say murderers are wrong. Therefore, the gigantic murder machine that is the state is also really wrong.
with theory and then say it has to work in practice.
You can define impracticality as not living up to your theory, even though millions die. Okay? The point is that when you reject the theory-practice dichotomy, you're saying it's going to work. And so, Zulu, we have to be true to our theory? No. We have to be true to theory and practice together. The theory has to work. And if I find some application of your theory...
The theory does work. The theory works right now. Doesn't matter how many injustices happen in the world. We know what is an injustice. That's why it works.
That's producing some really bad result, then it's for you to go back to the drawing board on your theory. The theory is the secondary, right? The primary is the fact of reality from which we derive the theory.
Right.
And if some fact of reality is badly inconvenient to your theory, you are embracing, in fact, the theory-practice dichotomy, Zulu, by insisting that theory trumps practice.
Yeah, that would actually be the primacy of consciousness.
That's
ironically.
the primacy. That he is the one engaged in primacy of consciousness by saying
it's just his consciousness.
My theory, do or die.
So, you of course know the Roy Childs argument that objectivism implies anarchism because you can't initiate force to stop people from, starting these defense agencies to compete. Now, I've frequently made the argument, and I think it's sound enough, but I don't think I've gone far enough. And let me explain to you. Yeah. What I've said is that assuming, it's a hypothetical, that there is a government that only protects rights.
Right.
Which cannot exist.
If somebody tried to set up a competitive agency, the risk would be so high of rights violations that organization would be justified in stopping it. I still agree with that. But
you're violating, if there's a competing agency and you're like, there's competition? We need to put them down. So much for a government that protects individual rights.
Let me go a little further even. I would say that the competing agencies necessarily involve rights violations. And I gave him an example. This was my example.
Before we hear his example, let me just illustrate something. You have Judge 1, and then you have a competing judge, Judge 2, and they just so happen to agree on everything. So, all the rules are consistent between the two. So, I just constructed something that violates your necessity right off the bat.
The kid is Man Sharma, is the guy that I was talking to, but nice guy.
Yeah.
So I said to him, I said, okay, suppose there's a government that exists to protect rights, and that's all it does. It's voluntarily funded. It just protects rights. I said, now,
But it's not voluntarily consented to. You are forced to associate with them.
suppose Man Sharma comes and he sets up an agency for self-defense. Okay, we'll let that go. You can set up your agency for self-defense, whatever. I said, now tell me this. You hire, I said, Carlos goes to you, hypothetical Carlos goes to you and hires you to be his self-defense agency. I said, now my government's still protecting me because I'm a citizen. I said, Carlos comes to you and tells you that I've robbed him. I said, now you come and apprehend me because Carlos says that I've robbed you. My government says you have no right to come and arrest Michael. We have jurisdiction. They come and take me back. And I said to him, who's initiated force? Well, you did rob him. No. I said he claimed I robbed him. The point is we don't yet know.
No,
we don't yet know. The only way you find out is if you implement proper procedures.
an objective code of evidence, an objective code of legal procedure.
Right.
Those are
I mean, is there any disagreement? I mean, like, I agree. I think Liquid Zulu would agree that, like, we hope that an institution of justice will exemplify justice to the best of its degree.
are essential to objective application
Yes.
of rights.
Yeah.
And you're right. Two competing agencies like that.
You know, the difference between statism and anarchism is that statism is selling you a guarantee. We're selling you a guarantee of this institution. Anarchism is doing the opposite. It's not selling you a guarantee. We do not guarantee your safety. Because we're not trying to impose a system and force everyone to associate with it. We're necessarily saying that association should be voluntary. And you have the right to disassociate, which necessarily means there are no guarantees for what's going to happen in society. That's not a bullet to bite. I love that. That's fucking awesome.
That necessitate force because the initiation of force. Somebody is going to be initiating force.
Yes, because we don't yet know the answer.
On the other hand, my monopoly government that doesn't violate rights that you pointed out is
But by being a monopoly, it is initiating force because it's forcing people to associate with it. So it's necessarily a rights violation. If you have a government where you have the complete voluntary right to associate it with it or not, you don't have a government. You have a club. You have a group of humans who are cooperating. Not the crime syndicate, which is government.
someone should want a howitzer, for his self-defense agency. I'm sorry, that's an aggressive threat. We are the monopoly on the use of that level of force, my friend. And your atomic bombs in your backyard and your howitzer in your private security
It's way too risky.
pose an aggressive threat to everyone else. Like,
You know, there is a valid reason to have nukes around. I'm sorry, hot take, but I think nukes can be helpful for destroying asteroids, and I do believe there will be some form of nuclear arsenal. And now I'm like, how does that work? How do we guarantee safety? Again, I'm an anarchist. I don't guarantee anything. I don't know what an anarchist society is going to look like. I have ideas. I have concepts of a plan, to quote Trump. But anarchists necessarily do not propose a guaranteed system. We necessarily propose that the only guarantee is that there is no guarantee. The only thing that we're guaranteeing is that we don't like crime syndicates who call themselves government. Because anarchism is the absence of a system. Necessarily.
Yes.
your example of just shooting a gun in the air or really drunk driving. Those people really ought to be, because they are threatening physical force. Now, Zulu understood that those were the initiation of force. Now, it's a question of knowing whether it's an initiation of force. And for that, I need one standard. I need one evidence code,
In a given
one
jurisdiction,
procedure
right.
code, one procedure.
Yeah, we have that. This is like what Zulu would agree. There is one law. It's called the non-aggression principle. It's the one natural law pertaining to justice. The natural law pertaining to human justice and human rights is the non-aggression principle. That is the true law. And in a society that respects that non-aggression principle, the judges collaboratively in society will work together in judge-found law. They will work together in discovering the particular implications of such a principle. Deduction, which is pure rationalism.
So I just had an interesting thought. Okay, so Randians, they hate Platonists. You know what's a reason for why Randians may hate anarcho-objectivists? Well, because what we're kind of describing, what ANCAPs are describing, is a society where justice is served by philosophers, because the judges are philosophers and they're discovering the natural law. So it is a society where justice is being served by philosophers, which is very reminiscent of Plato's Philosopher King. It's like Plato's Philosopher King without the king part. And I think that could be some sort of subconscious hang-up between Randians and Zuluians, because I think maybe Randians are suspecting that this is sort of like a Philosopher King moment where justice in society is served by a group of philosophers, which it is, but it's just like without the king part.
A system under which we decide these things. Private security agencies only work and only have themselves are subject to the principles of free market because there is a government of last resort who will decide on whether that private security agency is itself violated.
Now, Jim, if I could demonstrate that when you're talking about two individuals, a government and one defense agency can lead to irreconcilable conflict. Now, they, of course, postulate, no, they would go to arbitration and work it out. But you don't know that's going to happen. I mean, I could say any damn.
Yeah, you don't know. The only thing that we're saying that we know is that all of us being enslaved is not a good thing. So maybe we should start with not being enslaved, and then we can figure out society's problems. Because anarchism is not a solution to societal problems. Anarchism is a removal of the biggest problem humanity has ever faced, which is the superstition of political authority.
But the point is, if that's the case with just two, imagine if they were all over the place. And I gave my examples before, intellectual property, age of consent. There's a host of things. But the bottom line is it leads to a situation where individual rights are necessarily insecure. And now the point again, isn't that Zulu's wrong in his whole logical chain to be, an anarchist, whatever. The point is that anarchy is not consistent with objectivism. It's not consistent with the objectivist epistemology, the objectivist ethics, the objectivist theory of rights, none of it. Now, of course, if you postulate this axiom of non-aggression, it's a religious commandment that you must follow in all.
Yeah, none of it has been substantiated that it's a religious commandment. None of it has been substantiated that it's a deontology. Who's commanding it? Necessarily, if you go read The Ethics of Liberty by Murray Rothbard, he addresses that the non-aggression principle is not commanded into reality. I think, if to paraphrase Murray Rothbard, he said, well, some may ask, who says this is right? And he's saying, and Rothbard says, no one is saying it's right, and it's not right because someone says it. It's a natural law of fact. It's a property of human morality, which is not intrinsicism. Moving on.
Cases, well, then, of course, you say, oh, look, I want to go get myself an atomic bomb. I haven't initiated force against anybody. You have no right to stop me. Well, of course, because you're taking it as a religious principle, a deontological ethic, not as an ethic designed to help us survive and thrive on this planet.
What is the better protection for freedom? What is the better protection against the coercive use of force? One organization with the heavy artillery and the atomic bombs, or a variety of competing organizations that can
over the same jurisdiction. See, that's where it's important.
Over the same jurisdiction.
Yeah.
Now, exactly. No,
I think it's a terrible thought that a monopoly has a monopoly on nukes. The other thing is, I don't think really nukes should have ever been invented. There's probably better ways that we could, destroy asteroids that might impact Earth. But I think that is like the only healthy use of nukes. but I don't think nukes have ever been should have never been invented. They should have never been invented, but they are invented, so they're in this world now. Thanks statism. So like, what do we like? The thing is that the existence of nukes threatens humanity, and state or not, that's gonna happen. So like, if we're gonna have nukes, who would you rather have it? In the hand of a crime syndicate, and they're the only ones who can have it, or you get rid of the crime syndicate, so there's no use for nukes, because the only reason why you would have a nuke is because you're a big giant government. One crazy person cannot make a nuke by themselves. I don't think that's possible. I think you need like some sort of scientific institution and a group of scientists and engineers and a whole lot of resources to pull together to create one nuke. Such an institution would be an institution of government. And an institution in an anarchist society that has an arsenal of nukes would have to be voluntarily funded by the society which holds the value of non-aggression. So necessarily, if the majority of people are libertarians in a libertarian society, because you can't have a libertarian society without libertarians, these libertarians would be funding an organization that makes an arsenal of nukes. Such an institution would probably be an institution of science and a protection from foreign large objects that would come in and destroy Earth. So you'd nuke the asteroid that is about to impact Earth in order to save Earth. It'd be voluntarily funded. But government is not voluntarily funded, it is involuntarily funded. And necessarily the health of the state is war. So the use of nukes is explicitly used for war. You can only have war when you have warlords, otherwise known as presidents or kings. They're all warlords. Any lord is a warlord. Moving on.
In reality, now, as you point out, criminal, I can fully assure Zulu that in nearly every case of murder and robbery that I ever dealt with, those people were never going to submit to the same. And it goes back to my point about consensus agreement. Let's say only 1% of your population, and you know, criminals comprise a very small percent of the U.S. population right now. Let's imagine.
Nah, I just disagree. There's a lot more criminals than you think there are. Because criminals are not just what the government says. Because, as we know, government is an institution of crime itself. And you don't even have to be, like, a Randian to know that. Like, you could be a Randian and believe in the legitimacy of an objectivist state and still recognize that the states today are states of looters. So I don't really think they make up a very small portion of the population. I think they make up a substantial portion of our population.
Imagine that there is a society that agrees with his whole principle of law. 99% of them agree.
Oh, and further, this doesn't even include government agents. If you file a defamation lawsuit against someone, you're a criminal, because defamation's not a crime. So you're using the force of the state to put down someone who never committed a crime, but it's called a crime. But it's not, because defamation is not a crime. So someone who's filing that lawsuit is actually a criminal, and they're not even a government agent. So think about how many people in society really are criminals. And it's way more than just a little tiny amount.
Still, if only 1% of them are happy to engage in armed robberies and murders and rapes, well, guess what? They are precisely the ones who are not going to sit down and agree to your arbitration. They're precisely the ones who are rejecting your arbitration.
Right.
The very idea. And it's worse than that, because our violent criminals over there, they get organized. And even if that 1 or 2% of the population gets organized, you end up with the mafia. You end up with Don Corleone.
Well, that's what the mafia is. It's a police department for wise guys.
We call it the protection racket.
Well, what they say is
the very first scene of The Godfather. You know, I've been an American. I came to whatever that line is.
Yeah.
I'm proud to be an American.
Yeah.
And he then proceeds how the cops totally let down justice for his daughter.
And so he goes to the Don.
He goes to the Don. Now, that may give you an idea, and they give you the, kill these guys. No, your daughter's still alive, so we're going to do proportionate justice. Thank goodness for the honor code of Don Corleone, but we shouldn't be dependent on the honor code of Don Corleone's.
Yeah,
You'll remember later in The Godfather, the other mafia bosses do not share Don Corleone's honor code. We shouldn't be selling drugs to kids.
Yeah, I don't think Michael did either.
And Michael did either.
Right,
Exactly.
but
I never watched The
What also
Godfather.
is
Correction,
that
I
you're-
watched the first 20 minutes. My reaction to The Godfather is this reaction. I'm so sorry. I gotta pull this meme up.
We're all gonna die. There's one more secret I feel I have to share with you. I did not care for The Godfather.
What?
Did not care for The Godfather.
How can you even say that,
Didn't like it.
Peter, it's so good. It's like the perfect movie.
This is what everyone always says. Whenever they say,
Robert De Niro, Al Pacino. I mean, you
listen-
never see Robert Duvall.
no, fine actor. Did not like the movie. Why not? Couldn't get into it.
Explain yourself. What didn't you like about
It
it?
insists upon itself, Lois.
What?
It insists upon itself.
What does that even mean?
Because
it has a valid point to make. It's insistent.
It takes forever getting in. You spend like 6.5 hours, and then I can't even get through. I can't even finish the movie. I've never even seen the ending.
You've never seen the ending?
How can you say you don't like it if you haven't even given it a chance?
I agree with Stewie. It's not really fair.
I have tried on 3 separate occasions to get through it, and I get to the scene where all the guys are sitting around on the easy chairs.
Yeah, it's
and
a great scene. I love that
It's
scene.
not a great
in every annal.
I have no idea what they're talking about. It's like they're speaking a different language. That's where I lose interest and I go away.
Speaking Italian.
I've never finished The Godfather. I don't care for that movie.
Reliant on the personal morality of the different mafias?
Well, that's the thing is that's the other thing is that you will end up, if competition is as effective as they argue, right?
Yeah.
Then you're going to have an organization that's going to defend criminals. That's one already
correct.
happens, right? And
Precisely correct.
but you don't
And they're
have
not
the
gonna submit
overwhelming
to your
force.
arbitration.
You're going to have an institution that defends criminals if the institution itself is a criminal organization, such as a monopoly. And I'm not talking about, like, naturally forming monopolies, because what is a naturally forming monopoly? If you have a town of 100 people and there's one general store, and it's an isolated town, like a Wild West town, for example, you could claim that general store has a monopoly. That's not really meaningful information, though, because it's a small town. The only sensible sense of what is a monopoly is state-granted, state-privileged, state-sanctioned. And, of course, the state sanctions itself as a monopoly. That is a real, meaningful sense of what a monopoly is.
Rules.
Right. But that's the thing. There has to be a final arbiter. They say, no. Okay. Then I'm just going to keep appealing.
There actually has to be no arbiters. You could have 0 arbiters. You could have just Crusoe and just Friday alone on an island, and Friday is murdering Crusoe. And it's still wrong for Friday to murder Crusoe. Now, of course, just because it's wrong does not stop Crusoe. So we need to stop conflating ethics, what is right and wrong, with economics. How could we have enforcement mechanisms that would best tend towards the non-aggression principle? But there are no guarantees. That's a utopian way of thinking, in the way that I'm employing the term utopian. That is a utopian way of thinking. That you can guarantee justice in this world. You can't. Clearly you can't. We live in this world. And there's not a lot of justice going on. There's a lot of injustice going on. And that is a fact for the rest of eternity. You cannot fully guarantee justice. What you can guarantee is the knowledge of what is just and not.
Right? I want to go here. I want to go there. I want to go there. I want to go there.
Force is monopolizing outcomes.
Yes.
This is why force is not simply another commodity that can be sold on the free market. Free market principles do not apply to force and its proper application. There can be no market in force. Force itself is to monopolize outcomes, whether justly, efficiently, using the scarce resources properly, or not. Force will create injustice. Force will create inefficiency. By its nature, there can be no market in force. There must be a final arbiter. Because guess what? At the end of the day, the use of force, let's say when I began with the complex contract dispute, someone may have a rational view, a perfectly honest and sincere rational view that the judge got it wrong. But are we going to let him go now to Don Corleone or someone who doesn't share Don Corleone's sense of honor to get revenge? Well, you've got this ongoing lifetime right to vigilantism. So under his system, so when Ayn Rand says anarchism necessarily implies gang warfare, ultimately, and a retrogression.
No, necessarily it implies no gang warfare. The philosophy of anarchism, which is not a system, the philosophy of anarchism is against gang warfare inherently. That is the philosophy of anarchism. Now, whether or not gang warfare happens or not is independent from the fact that anarchists disagree with gang warfare. So it'd be completely disingenuous to say that anarchists want gang warfare.
Of civilization. It is the establishment of a rule of law, a uniform due process. And in some ways, Zulu, let me suggest to you that even if that system of due process and rule of law, if some of their laws get it wrong sometimes, I'd rather live in that monopoly situation than in a world of
monopoly situation, meaning gang situation. Remember, the state is a gang. Government is a gang of criminals. Necessarily, a monopoly is a gang of criminals. It is a cartel. What anarchists are saying is that maybe we should not have gangs of criminals. Maybe we should not have warlords ruling over us. What statists want is, no, those are not gangs. It's an institution of justice that enslaves me. So to say, listen, you can argue with anarchists. It's like, your ideas don't work in reality. But what you cannot say, or it would be disingenuous to say, is that anarchists want gang warfare. It is not disingenuous to say that about statists, because statists do want gang warfare. They just don't call it gangs, they call it government, they call it state. But there is no difference. There is no difference between a government and a gang of criminals. A government is a gang of criminals. The only thing you could say that is a difference is that people believe there is a difference. But there is no difference. All governments have taxed. Even if you have a government that does not tax, necessarily by the nature of government, since it is a monopoly, self-granting itself the status of a monopoly, you are forced to live under it. What if they get it wrong? Objectivists guarantee that their objectivist government will get it right, but they don't know that. They don't know if the objectivist government will get it right. So what happens when they get it wrong? But they're a monopoly, so you are forced to associate with it. Do you see the problem here? An anarchist society is not a perfect society, but at least it's not a society of slaves and slave masters.
Gang warfare, where it's, the Corleone family versus the Tattaglia family. Okay?
It wasn't Tattaglia, it was Bazzini all along, Jim.
It was Barzini. Tattaglia's a pimp. But
Yeah, he is. Yeah, he couldn't have fought outfought
Nominally
Santino.
between Barzini and Tattaglia, or
Right.
between
Now-
Barzini and Corleone. Right.
The last part of the Zulu stuff, and then I want to discuss a little Dave Smith, is
Yeah.
his claim that objectivism is an open system. Now, by open, he says what he means is the consistent application of the primacy of existence, and you apply that, and if all your conclusions are correct, you're still in objectivism. And of course, he's the one that has all the right deductions and everything else, but he doesn't seem to understand that rational people can be mistaken. So other people can come along and say, no, my interpretation of objective.
What if those rational people are the heads of the objectivist state that has a monopoly? You've exacerbated the issue. Humans can make mistakes, but you've exacerbated the issue by making the mistake monopolized. You've monopolized the mistake. Now everyone has to deal with it. Everyone who's forced to associate with the mistake, instead of voluntarily disassociating from the mistake. But your complaint is that, but we can't guarantee that yes, I don't guarantee that there will be no mistakes in an anarchist society. What I guarantee is that people will be better off by not being forced to associate with an institution that makes mistakes.
Objectivism is the right one, and you end up with no objectivism. Saying objectivism is a closed system, it doesn't imply that Ayn Rand is right or that objectivism's right. If there's errors in objectivism that she made, then there's errors in objectivism, and it doesn't imply that she found all truths. It just says that any new truths that are founded, even those that are consistent with objectivism, are not part of objectivism.
That is precisely correct. If Ayn Rand made a mistake, now, Ayn Rand, philosophy is a very distinct subject. And so it's not everything Ayn Rand said. Objectivism is consists of only those philosophical principles. They have to be principles. They have to be principles of philosophy. They have to be principles of philosophy she recognized as philosophy. It's not, for example, her taste in turquoise blue, throw pillows. That's not objectivism, as Leonard makes very clear. Objectivism is a set of philosophical principles. It is Ayn Rand's philosophical principles. If you have any disagreement with those, you're not an objectivist. Full stop. So we're defining the thing. So it's like he's saying, well, there's this chair over there, but it's really not a chair. But I get to call something a chair that's not a chair if it mostly complies with what I think.
What they fail to consider is that what if Ayn Rand was inconsistent with her own principles? Do you follow the inconsistency or do you follow the principles? What is objectivism? Is objectivism the inconsistencies of Ayn Rand, or is it the principle consistently, despite the inconsistencies of Ayn Rand? Which I would say those principles of objectivism are the essence of objectivism. But if Ayn Rand was inconsistent with those, which Liquid Zulu would argue for, then just being more consistent with those objectivist principles does not make you not an objectivist. It just makes you a better objectivist.
She thought chairs meant. No,
not she thought. He says that what she thought is not relevant.
Right. He disagrees with something. In fact, makes something irrelevant that she did think philosophically. Then you're not an objectivist. What you say is,
most ANCAPs are against intellectual property, especially with the emergence of Stephan Kinsella. With the emergence of Stephan Kinsella, it's been a consensus in the libertarian community, or at least in the ANCAP community, that intellectual property is a myth. However, this was not always the case, because Rothbard inconsistently justified a form of intellectual property in his book, The Ethics of Liberty. It is just an inconsistency, and that's okay. We don't expect the pioneers of a beautiful philosophical system to get it right all the time. It's okay. We'll correct it. The refiners afterwards, after the great innovator of a philosophy, the refiners will refine it and make it more consistent. And that's okay.
I am not an objectivist. I agree with certain points and this is what would be the correct approach. There are certain things Ayn Rand said that I agree with. I would respectfully say to him, you're taking them out of context. You don't even understand those. But the point is, he would say, I think it is morally wrong to initiate force. I think reason is important. Whatever he wants to say, I agree with. I mean, I'd take issue probably with the consistency of those, but state what the principles you do agree with. I mean, he doesn't understand what Ayn Rand means by principle, frankly. But say the parts of objectivism that you think you agree with, and then say, look, but I'm not an objectivist. Well, right off the bat, I'm an anarchist. He doesn't even have to get our points about rationalism and intrinsicism to see how fundamentally he's not an objectivist. But just on the face of it, if Leonard Peikoff says, look, politics is the study of the proper government. Oh, well, you see, it's not a circular argument. He's going to give you the reasons why we believe we need a monopoly of legitimate use of force.
But as Liquid Zulu would argue, the start of the question of a proper government is inconsistent with the principles of objectivism. That would be his argument. You should address that. It's just I think there's a lack of addressing Liquid Zulu's argument and a copium amount of constructing straw mans in order to make Liquid Zulu look bad. which I know me and Liquid Zulu we have our differences, but I'm not gonna stand by strawmans of any kind. And especially since, I also just want to defend anarchism too. I just want to defend anarchism. I want to defend the non-aggression principle, even if I have moved on from certain objectivist principles that I now disagree with, and I am in the middle of rehauling my entire philosophical scheme. But that's okay. I'm growing as a person. Even if I am going in the wrong direction, I'm honest about it. I'm honest that I am attempting to find the truth of the matter here. Not quite relevant to what's going on here. I just made it about me. My bad.
But it's not a circular argument, because he's going to give you an inductive argument for why we need a government. On the other hand, if you disagree with any of those principles, you are ipso facto not an objectivist. Objectivism isn't any old thing someone happens. I'm an objectivist except I believe in God. Or I'm an objectivist. I'm an objectivist except I'm a determinist.
I've seen both, and I will agree that there's no way that determinism or God is consistent with the objectivist scheme. Of course, it absolutely violates those principles. Just simply that doesn't apply right here. I don't think that's what's going on with Liquid Zulu. It's not that he's disagreeing with the principles. He's disagreeing with Ayn Rand's inconsistency with her own principles.
I'm an objectivist, except I don't believe in the validity of the senses. I'm an objectivist, but I don't believe that concept formation is for unit economy. No, any of those knocks you out of the whole category, okay? And it goes all the way down to her aesthetic and political principles.
So, okay, so I'm going to summarize, and if I get the summary wrong.
If we were to have a political system, something like Ayn Rand's political system would be, obviously way better than right now. And Ayn Rand's political system mirrors the philosophy of Rothbard in many ways. There is some agreement, it's not a full agreement, there is some agreement that the initiation of force or threat of force is wrong. There is some agreement that society should be voluntary. There is some agreement that there should be a free market. There's a lot of parallels. As Samuel Konkin has coined the term minarchism, we could call Ayn Rand's philosophy, political philosophy, a sort of minarchism, which simply just means that it's minimal archy as opposed to no archy or anarchy. So it's not like these two different political philosophies, the anti-political philosophy of Murray Rothbard and the confused political philosophy of Ayn Rand, it's not like they're so far removed from each other. They're really close. There's a lot of common grounds. The difference is Ayn Rand starts with the question, what is the proper role of government? But Rothbard starts with the question, is there a proper role of government? Now, if you start with the question, what is the proper role of government, with the objectivist principles, you're going to construct the Randian political philosophy. And that makes sense. It does follow from her principles. It is a mistaken question, but given that question, what follows makes sense from the objectivist principle. Insofar as it does make sense, it does break down in making sense because the question is nonsense. But if you start with a different question, well, is government valid to begin with? Which Randians necessarily don't want to entertain. But if you start with the question, well, is government legitimate to begin with? Then you go into Murray Rothbard's philosophy, which is a neo-Aristotelian, neo-Thomist foundation, which is closely related to the objectivist foundation. So what Liquid Zulu is doing is that his foundation is objectivism, but he asks and answers a different question, which the question is consistent with the principles. But Rand's question, what is the proper role of government, is inconsistent with the principles. Because essentially what is she saying? She's saying, what is the proper role of crime syndicates? She has failed to identify the nature of government, which is They're crime syndicates. You look at all governments throughout all of history. There has never been a just government. And there's never been, ever recorded in human history, a government founded on the principles of justice. Not even the American government. Not even the American government during the Articles of Confederation era. There has always been extortion with every government. There's always been slavery with every government. There's always been regulations. There's always been control. And there's always been forced association with every government. And if your essence of government literally does not match with any government ever, your essence is whack. It's because you started with a whack question. What is the proper role of government? You started with a Hobbesian start to government. So it's just an inconsistency, which is fine. It doesn't make Ayn Rand not an objectivist and Liquid Zulu the true objectivist. Because, you know, it's simply a mistake. But it was a mistake with the honesty to her own principles. It was an honest inconsistency. At least I hope it was an honest inconsistency. But nevertheless, it is an inconsistency. So don't excommunicate more consistent objectivists for simply being more consistent to the principles and not consistent to whatever Ayn Rand says. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't say that objectivism is these principles and objectivism is whatever Ayn Rand says. Because with any innovator of a systematic philosophy, the innovator is just one guy. So there's probably going to be inconsistencies. And it's up to refiners, after the philosophy has been established, after the principle has been established, it's up to the followers to make it more consistent. Otherwise, you have a dead system. And the thing is that Liquid Zulu is reviving your dead philosophy by making it an open system, by making a system that grows and corrects its own inconsistencies. But you guys don't want to correct your own inconsistencies. That's not what Ayn Rand says.
Which I'm sure I won't. You just tell me. Liquid Zulu epistemologically is not an objectivist. He is a rationalist. And to be fair, with some maybe objectivist ideas embedded in his rationalism, but he's a rationalist nonetheless.
Like Murray Rothbard.
Sure.
Influenced by Ayn Rand anarchist.
Right. By trying also trying to incorporate Hoppe and Rothbard with Rand, not an objectivist.
Just does not work.
Saying that politics is not a branch of philosophy, not an objectivist.
Not an objectivist, right?
I don't know what exactly is Liquid Zulu's current opinion on argumentation ethics, but let's just say he still accepts argumentation ethics just like he has been always. And like I would argue that as an inconsistency. But that's okay. It's okay to have a collaborative effort in order to figure out what is consistent and what is inconsistent with the principles. That's fine. It's fine to grow as a community. Alright, we're back.